Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a town. It sits somewhere in the middle of America, though no map has ever quite agreed on where. It has a nuclear power plant that glows faintly at the edge of town, a tavern with a broken neon sign that hums through the night, a school where the same children have sat in the same desks for over 30 years, and a church where the same family fills the same pew every single Sunday without ever seeming to age. This town is Springfield. You already know it. You grew up with it, in a way. You heard the theme music before you were old enough to understand what the show was about, and something about the yellow glow of it, the warmth of that opening sequence, those characters bouncing home on a couch became a kind of comfort. It was always there. Sunday nights. Reruns on weekday afternoons. Background noise on a tired Tuesday. Springfield was always humming somewhere nearby. But the longer you sit with Springfield, the stranger it becomes. Because beneath all the warmth and the laughter and the familiarity, there are questions that were never answered, patterns that were never fully explained. Strange continuities and stranger inconsistencies that accumulate over 35 seasons into something that feels less like careless writing and more like intention. Like someone embedded a puzzle inside the most beloved animated series of all time and then quietly waited to see if anyone would notice. Tonight, we're going to look at those questions together. We're going to walk through Springfield slowly, no rush, no urgency, no bright lights or sudden revelations, just a calm, unhurried exploration of the mysteries that have been hiding in plain sight for decades. The things that don't quite add up, the characters who seem to know more than they're saying. The moments where the show pulled back a curtain and then quietly let it fall closed again before anyone could see what was behind it. This is a long journey. There's no reason to hurry. Let your body settle. Let your breathing slow, and let's just wander through Springfield together, one mystery at a time. Section 1. The town that time forgot. There is a word for what Springfield does with time, and that word is ignore. Not in a careless way, not in the way of bad writers who simply forgot to track their own continuity. The Simpsons has, at various points, employed some of the most celebrated writers in American comedy, people who went on to create other landmark shows, write for late-night television, publish novels. These are not people who forgot things. These are people who made very specific choices about what to remember and what to let slide. So when Springfield bends time, when it folds it, stretches it, loops it back on itself in ways that shouldn't be possible, it feels less like an accident and more like a decision. The question is just, what decision and why? Let's start with the simplest version of the mystery. The Simpsons premiered in December 1989. Homer and Marge are adults in that episode, parents, homeowners, people with jobs and mortgages, and the particular kind of tired that comes from having responsibilities. Bart is 10. Lisa is 8. Maggie is a baby. In 2024, Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still a baby. This is, on its face, not surprising. It's a cartoon. And cartoons famously don't age their characters. The Flintstones ran for 6 seasons. The Jetsons ran for 2. Scooby-Doo has been solving mysteries since 1969. Cartoon characters exist outside of normal time, and we accept this implicitly when we sit down to watch them. But here's where Springfield becomes strange. Other cartoons simply don't age. They exist in an eternal present with no reference to the outside world. But Springfield constantly, obsessively references the real world. It makes jokes about the presidency. It parodies current movies. It comments on modern technology, on social media, on streaming services and smartphones, and the specific texture of contemporary American life. And so the question of time becomes inescapable, because if the show is set in the present day and Bart is still 10 years old, then something very specific has happened to time in Springfield. It has been stretched, or more precisely, it has been detached. Springfield floats. It exists in a kind of temporal pocket that is connected to the real world through culture and current events, but disconnected from the real world through biology and personal history. The characters absorb the present without aging into it, and the show knows this. It knows it so clearly that it has commented on it directly, multiple times, across multiple decades. There have been episodes where characters acknowledge the show's longevity. There have been jokes about Bart never growing up. There have been moments where the writers wink at the camera and say, "Yes, we know. We've always known." But acknowledgement isn't explanation. Knowing the mystery exists is different from solving it. And the closer you look at Springfield's relationship with time, the stranger that mystery becomes. Consider the backstory episodes. In the first few seasons, the show established a fairly consistent timeline for Homer and Marge's past. They met in high school in what appeared to be the mid to late 1970s. Homer's father, Abe, was a veteran of World War II. Marge's parents were of a certain generation. There was a coherent chronology, not rigid but sensible. By the mid-1990s, that timeline had already started to shift. By the 2000s, it had shifted significantly. By the 2010s, Homer and Marge's high school years had migrated forward to the 1990s. Abe Simpson, who had once been a proud veteran of the Pacific Theater, began to have his wartime stories quietly revised. The generational math simply didn't work anymore, and so the show adjusted. This is called, in fan communities, the floating timeline, and it's a well-documented phenomenon in long-running serialized fiction. But what makes Springfield's floating timeline unusual is how aware the show seems to be of its own paradox. There's an episode, one of the more philosophically interesting ones, in which someone asks why Springfield doesn't change, why everything stays the same, why the children don't grow. And the answer given is something close to, because some places just don't. Because there are towns, real towns, that seem to exist outside of time's usual jurisdiction, where the same faces appear in the same places year after year, where nothing quite changes, where the outside world pulses and shifts and transforms, while the town itself remains curiously still. It's played for laughs. Most of Springfield's existential moments are. But underneath the joke, there's something that feels almost like an admission. What if Springfield isn't just a floating timeline because of the demands of animated television? What if the town itself within the logic of the show's world has some property that holds time at bay? What if whatever is in the water, or the air, or perhaps the nuclear reactor at the edge of town has created a kind of stasis? This is a theory that circulates among serious Simpsons enthusiasts, and it's more coherent than it first appears. The Springfield nuclear power plant, which we'll discuss in much greater detail later in our journey tonight, is not a well-run facility. This has been established in episode after episode over 35 years. The safety record is catastrophic. The environmental impact on the surrounding area is never fully reckoned with. And yet Springfield persists a little yellow, a little strange, but fundamentally intact. What if the radiation isn't destroying Springfield? What if, in some deeply improbable way, it's preserving it? There are smaller wrinkles in Springfield's time problem that are worth noting quietly, the way you notice the details of a room you've walked through 100 times but never quite studied. Take the Simpson family home at 742 Evergreen Terrace. This house has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times across the show's run that tracking its physical history becomes an exercise in deliberate impossibility. It has burned down. It has been remodeled. Extensions have been added and then forgotten. The basement appears and disappears depending on the needs of a given episode. The garage has housed cars, Homer's barbershop quartet memorabilia, a racing simulator, and at least one indoor swimming pool across various episodes, and none of these things seem to affect the others. The house, like the town, floats. But here's the detail that catches the eye upon reflection. 742 Evergreen Terrace always looks the same. The exterior shot, that distinctive two-story American house with the small front yard and the single tree, is one of the most consistent images in the show's entire visual vocabulary. The interior may be a maze of impossibility, but the outside is fixed, anchored, as if the show is telling us something about the relationship between appearances and reality in Springfield. The outside is stable, the inside is chaos, but from the street, everything looks perfectly fine. This is, when you think about it, quite a lot like Springfield itself. From the outside, from the perspective of someone just watching the show casually, it's a cheerful, familiar cartoon town. But the longer you spend inside it, the more the geography stops making sense. Streets lead to places they shouldn't. The nuclear plant is sometimes visible from the Simpsons' backyard and sometimes seems miles away. The town has a beach, and also mountains, and also a canyon, and also farmland, and also dense urban areas depending on the episode. Springfield contains more geography than any real town could hold. And perhaps this is the key to the time mystery. Perhaps Springfield isn't a real place at all, not even within the fiction of the show. Perhaps it's something more like a state of mind, a place that exists because people believe in it and shifts its shape to accommodate whatever story needs to be told. A town made entirely of accumulated stories, held together not by geography or chronology but by the weight of affection. If that sounds too poetic to be a real theory about a cartoon, consider this. The show's creator, Matt Groening, has never definitively revealed where Springfield is. He has, over the years, given contradictory hints. He has pointed to Oregon, to Illinois, to Kansas, to states that border each other and states that don't. He has said that the intentional vagueness is the point that Springfield is meant to be anywhere, everywhere, the average American town generalized to the point of universality. But there's a town in Oregon called Springfield that has, over the years, developed a whole relationship with the show. There are real Springfields in dozens of American states. The name itself is a kind of universal, the most common place name in America, appearing in nearly every state in the Union. And Matt Groening grew up in Portland, Oregon, which is close to the Oregon Springfield. So perhaps the floating location and the floating timeline are connected. Perhaps a town that can't be pinned to a place can't be pinned to a time either. Perhaps Springfield's mystery is that it's not any specific town, it's the idea of a town. And ideas don't age. But then, why does it feel so specific? Why does it feel so particular, so detailed, so much like a real place? Maybe because the best ideas always do. If you're watching this late at night, or early in the morning, or somewhere in between, drop a comment and let us know where you are and what time it is. There's something comforting about knowing that someone else is awake in a different corner of the world, listening to the same stories. And if these mysteries are the kind of thing you want to keep exploring, consider subscribing. There are many more nights like this one ahead. Section 2. The Nuclear Conspiracy MR. Burns and the Poisoning of Springfield. Before we go any further into Springfield's mysteries, we need to talk about the building at the edge of town. You know the one. You've seen its twin cooling towers in 1,000 establishing shots, backlit by sunset or storm clouds or the particular greenish glow that the show associates with radiation and with money. The Springfield nuclear power plant is one of the most iconic fictional buildings in American popular culture, as recognizable as the bat signal, as familiar as the Bates Motel, as loaded with symbolic weight as any architectural image in television history. But here's what's strange about it. After 35 years, we still don't fully understand what the plant is doing to Springfield. We know it's not good. The show has been very clear about this. Homer Simpson has, over the decades, caused nuclear incidents that by any reasonable assessment should have resulted in the evacuation, quarantine, and federal investigation of an entire region. Radioactive materials have been dumped casually. Safety protocols have been violated so consistently that the violations seem to be the protocol. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has visited, been deceived, been bribed, been charmed, and left without meaningful action more times than can be counted. And yet, Springfield persists. The people of Springfield are not sick, or at least not in ways that seem to be addressed. The fish in the river occasionally have 3 eyes, and this has been treated as a running joke for decades. But the people themselves appear to be functioning, tired, stressed, occasionally radioactively glowing, but functional. So what is the plant actually doing? To answer that, you have to think about Charles Montgomery Burns. Mr. Burns is one of the great villains of American television, and the word villain is important here, because it's a word the show uses deliberately and then immediately complicates. Burns is cartoonishly evil, in the way that a character can only be when the show loves them too much to leave them at one-dimensional. He's cruel in the specific way of someone who has never been told no by a universe he's spent a century bending to his will. He's petty and grandiose in the same moment. He keeps exotic animals as pets and fires employees for sport, and once blocked out the sun over the entire town of Springfield because he was annoyed by competition from solar energy. The sun-blocking episode is worth pausing on, because it's where the conspiracy theory really begins. In that episode, one of the most beloved 2-part stories in the show's history, Mr. Burns constructs a giant disk to block sunlight from reaching Springfield, intending to force the town into greater dependence on nuclear power. He calls it his excellent plan, and he's right that it's conceptually impressive in the way that only the worst ideas can be. The townspeople are outraged. Someone shoots Mr. Burns. The mystery of who pulled the trigger becomes the show's first genuine cliffhanger. But the conspiracy that interests us tonight is subtler than sunblocking. It's not about a dramatic plot. It's about something quieter and more persistent. What has Mr. Burns been doing to Springfield's environment for the last 100 years? Because Mr. Burns has been running that plant for a very long time. Exactly how long is one of the show's most carefully maintained ambiguities. Burns is old preposterously, impossibly old. His precise age has been given as different numbers at different points in the show's history, ranging from somewhere in his 80s to well over 100. He has memories of events that span most of the 20th century. He has fought in wars, outlived rivals, weathered economic catastrophes, and accumulated so much wealth and power that he seems to have transcended the normal relationship between a human being and their circumstances. He is, to put it plainly, almost certainly not supposed to still be alive. And yet he is. We'll explore Burns's strange immortality in detail a little later tonight. But for now, consider what it means for the power plant. If Burns has been running this facility for 60, 70, perhaps 80 years, and running it with the safety standards we've watched in operation, what has that done to the soil, the water, the air, and the people of Springfield? The three-eyed fish is named Blinky. It was introduced early in the show's run as a symbol of environmental negligence, and it keeps appearing quietly, consistently, in the background of episodes that have nothing to do with environmental themes. Blinky is just there, in the river, living, three eyes open. There have been episodes in which the water supply of Springfield has been explicitly contaminated. There have been episodes in which the air has been colored strange shades by industrial runoff. There have been episodes in which Homer himself has been soaked in radioactive materials with consequences that seem alarming in the moment and then simply don't persist into the next episode. This is, on the surface, just the floating continuity of a long-running animated show. Events happen and then reset because the format requires it. But there's a more interesting reading. What if the contamination doesn't reset? What if it accumulates? What if the reason Springfield's residents seem functional despite decades of environmental assault is that they've been gradually, imperceptibly adapted to it? What if the radiation hasn't made them sick, or at least not in ways that look like conventional sickness, but has instead made them something slightly different from ordinary Americans? This theory has a name in certain corners of Simpsons scholarship, the Springfield mutation hypothesis. And while it's obviously not a scientific framework, this is a cartoon, and we're exploring ideas rather than making empirical claims, it does explain some things that are otherwise difficult to account for. It explains why Springfieldians seem to have a higher than average tolerance for physical trauma. Homer has survived explosions, falls from great heights, electrocution, being struck by vehicles, and a litany of other events that would be immediately fatal for an ordinary human being. His survival is played for comedy, he's a cartoon character, and cartoon characters bounce, but the show occasionally seems to acknowledge that Homer's resilience is unusual even within its own logic. It explains the town's relationship with food. The food at Krusty Burger and the Frying Dutchman and the other Springfield establishments is consistently described as deeply unhealthy, not just nutritionally poor, but occasionally literally dangerous. And yet Springfield doesn't have an obviously elevated mortality rate. People get sick, people die, but the town continues. It might even explain, in a roundabout way, the floating timeline. If Springfield's residents are being slowly, subtly altered by decades of low-level radiation, not in a science fiction monster way, but in a quieter biological way, perhaps one of the effects is a kind of temporal compression, a slowing of cellular change, a gentle, almost imperceptible resistance to the passage of time. This is, to be clear, a theory built on the imaginative foundations of a children's cartoon. But it's a theory that the show itself seems to at least gesture toward, in the way it keeps returning to the power plant as the center of Springfield's story. Because the plant isn't just Burns' source of income. It's the town's source of power, in every sense. It employs a significant portion of Springfield's adult population. It shapes the economy. It sits at the geographic and narrative center of so many of the show's most important stories. When Homer goes to work in the morning, he goes to the nuclear plant. When Burns wants to threaten someone, he threatens their livelihood at the plant. When the show wants to comment on American labor relations, or corporate greed, or the relationship between ordinary workers and impossible employers, it does it through the plant. The plant is Springfield. Springfield is the plant. And what the plant does to Springfield, to the soil and the water and the air and the people, is something the show has been quietly exploring for 35 years without ever fully resolving. There is, however, one more layer to the conspiracy theory that deserves attention. Burns knows. This is the detail that makes the theory more than just an interesting extrapolation. There have been episodes in which Mr. Burns has demonstrated a clear awareness of the environmental impact of his plant. He's been presented with evidence of contamination, he's been taken to court, he's been visited by regulators. And in each case, he's responded with the particular, serene confidence of a man who knows that no amount of evidence will result in meaningful consequences. He knows because he has always known. The plant has never been run safely because running it safely was never the goal. The goal was, and has always been, profit. And the most straightforward path to profit in the energy sector is to externalize as many costs as possible onto the community, the environment, and the future. Burns is very old. He understands the long game. He understands that consequences tend to arrive after the decisions that create them, and he has structured his life so that the consequences arrive for other people. What's interesting is that the show presents this with remarkable clarity and then doesn't make it the moral center of any single episode. The Burns as environmental villain storyline is always present, but it's never the whole point. It's background radiation present, persistent, low level, and, perhaps, cumulative. Much like the plant itself. Section 3. Homer's Coma. The Dream That Never Ended. There is a theory about Homer Simpson that starts simply enough and then opens into something vast. It begins with a single episode from the show's 6th season, an episode called Homer the Great, though the theory is most often associated with a different episode. So it's come to this, a Simpsons clip show. In that episode, Bart's April Fool's prank on Homer results in Homer falling into a medically induced coma. He is revived by the end of the episode. The family gathers. There are jokes. Homer wakes up, the story resolves, and life in Springfield continues. Except what if it didn't? The Homer coma theory, sometimes called the dead Homer theory or the sleeping Homer theory, proposes that Homer never actually woke up from that coma. That everything that has happened in The Simpsons since that episode, all the adventures, all the humor, all the 30-plus years of stories is the interior life of a man lying unconscious in a Springfield hospital bed dreaming. This is, on its surface, a familiar kind of fan theory. The "it was all a dream" interpretation is one of the oldest tricks in storytelling, and it's often applied lazily to long-running narratives as a way of explaining away inconsistencies. But the Homer coma theory is worth spending some time with tonight, because it has more internal coherence than it might initially seem, and because it touches on something genuinely interesting about how the show works. Let's start with what the theory explains. It explains the floating timeline, which we discussed in our first section. Dreams don't observe chronological time. In dreams, years can pass in moments, and moments can stretch into years. A dreaming Homer would experience time the way Springfield experiences time discontinuously, cyclically, without the steady forward pressure of biological aging. It explains the increasingly surreal quality of the show's later seasons. The episodes from the first decade of the show's run are, by near universal agreement, more grounded than what came after. The situations are exaggerated but recognizable. The emotional beats are more consistently connected to real human experience. The later seasons from about season 10 onward, depending on whom you ask, become stranger, more disconnected, more willing to abandon realism in favor of something more dreamlike. If Homer is dreaming, this makes sense. The early episodes are the outer layers of the dream, where the architecture of waking life is still visible. The later episodes are the deeper layers, where the dream has started to follow its own logic instead of borrowing from reality. It explains why Homer consistently survives things that should kill him. We mentioned this in our discussion of the plant, but it bears revisiting here. Homer's physical resilience is, even by cartoon standards, extraordinary. He falls off cliffs and gets up. He's run over by cars and recovers. He's had anvils dropped on him, been launched into the air, been compressed, flattened, and reconstituted in ways that would be comic book impossible even for a character operating under cartoon physics. But a dreaming man can't be killed by his own dream. The dreamer is always safe, no matter how the dream's imagery threatens him. The body lying in the hospital bed is fine. The Homer inside the dream is therefore invincible by definition. It explains the family's emotional consistency. No matter how badly Homer behaves, no matter how many mistakes he makes, how many jobs he loses, how many catastrophes he causes, the family comes back together. The love between Homer and Marge never permanently fractures. The relationship between father and children always finds its way back to warmth. Real relationships don't work this way. But the relationship a man has with his deepest wishes, with the image of his family that he holds in his heart that might, in Homer's coma dream, his family is always going to be okay. They're always going to be there when he wakes up. The dream protects the thing he loves most. There's something genuinely moving about this interpretation when you sit with it. Homer Simpson, who is often portrayed as lazy, selfish, oblivious, is, in this reading, a man so devoted to his family that his unconscious mind has been constructing elaborate scenarios in which they're together for 30-plus years. A man who has been holding them in his mind through every kind of chaos and crisis, returning always to the warmth of the house on Evergreen Terrace. The dream is an act of love. Now, the show has never confirmed this theory. The writers have, when asked, generally deflected or dismissed it, though not always with the categorical denial you might expect. And there are things the theory doesn't explain well. For instance, the show has, at several points, depicted Homer dreaming. It has depicted his imagination. It has shown us his mental life in some detail, and the interior landscapes it reveals are quite specific. They don't look like the rest of the show. Homer's dreams have a different visual texture, a different logic. If the whole show were his dream, you'd expect it to share these qualities. It doesn't, quite. But the theory's persistence, the way it keeps circulating, the way fans keep returning to it decade after decade, suggests it's touching something real about the show, even if it's not literally accurate. Maybe what it's touching is this. The Simpsons has always been a show about the interior life of a family, about the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love, about the gap between who we are and who we wish we were, and the imaginative effort it takes to bridge that gap every day. Homer, awake or asleep, is a man reaching for something he can almost but not quite grasp. He loves his family more than he can say and shows it less than he means to. He wants to be a hero in the story of his own life, but the story keeps complicating things. And so he keeps dreaming, keeps trying again, in episode after episode, across decade after decade, and sometimes he gets it right, and sometimes he doesn't, and the dream continues. The coma theory asks us to take that metaphor literally. But even as a metaphor, it does something valuable. It reminds us that the show's endless reinvention, its willingness to imagine Homer in any situation and any role, is itself a kind of dream logic. The show is always asking, what if Homer were an astronaut? What if he were a food critic? What if he were a rock star, a food truck owner, a soldier, an inventor, a saint? These are the questions dreams ask. And Springfield, it turns out, is very good at dreaming. There's a secondary version of this theory that's worth mentioning as we drift deeper into the night. Some theorists have proposed not that Homer is dreaming, but that Homer is dead, that he died at some point during the show's run, and what we're watching is a version of an afterlife. This version points to specific episodes in which Homer has experiences that closely resemble near-death experience accounts. Tunnels of light, encounters with deceased relatives, conversations with beings that seem to occupy a different ontological plane. The show has had multiple episodes dealing with death and the afterlife. God appears several times, angels make appearances. The nature of heaven and hell is explored with the cheerful theological casualness that characterizes Springfield's relationship with everything. In this reading, Springfield is purgatory. Not in a punishing sense. Springfield is generally a pleasant enough place to be, but in the sense of a waiting room. A place where things are resolved slowly, where lessons are learned and relearned, where the soul works through its attachments before moving on. If that's what Springfield is, then the floating timeline makes a different kind of sense. Purgatory doesn't have time the way the living world does. It has duration, things proceed, but the clocks don't tick in the same direction. You are there until you're ready to leave, and readiness is the only measure. Homer, in this reading, is not yet ready. He still has things to figure out. He still has relationships to mend and wisdom to accumulate and moments of grace to earn. And so Springfield continues, patient and golden and slightly strange, holding him in its amber light until the time comes. Section 4. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Reopening the case. On the 21st of May, 1995, something happened to American television. A cartoon villain was shot by an unknown assailant, and the country lost its collective mind trying to figure out who did it. The shooting of Mr. Burns, the cliffhanger ending of The Simpsons' sixth season, became a genuine cultural phenomenon. There were newspaper columns, radio discussions, fan theories, betting pools. The show ran a promotion allowing viewers to mail in their guesses. The reveal, when it came in the seventh season premiere, managed to be both surprising and deeply satisfying. The shooter was Maggie Simpson, Maggie the baby, Maggie who never speaks, Maggie who had been sitting in the background of Springfield's story for 6 years at that point, nursing her pacifier and observing everything with those enormous, expressive eyes. The explanation given in the episode is that Burns, in an earlier altercation, had leaned on Maggie and accidentally caused her to fire a gun she'd found. It was not premeditated. It was an accident. Maggie didn't mean to shoot anyone. And yet, the scene in which Maggie holds the gun, the image that ran in the closing credits of Season 6, doesn't look like an accident. It looks like intention. Maggie's grip is deliberate. Her eyes are focused. In the famous moonlit moment when the shooter's identity is first glimpsed before the cut to credits, the figure is small and purposeful. The resolution the show gave us, accident, not murder, is the official answer. But official answers in Springfield have a complicated relationship with truth. And so the question circulates. What if it wasn't an accident? What if Maggie Simpson, silent and observant and underestimated by everyone around her, shot Mr. Burns on purpose? To explore this possibility, we need to think about what Maggie knew. The premise of the shooting episode is that Mr. Burns, in the grip of one of his schemes, had done something that hurt the entire town of Springfield. A sun-blocking device that cut off the town's access to natural light. The townspeople were angry. The list of people with motive to harm Burns was essentially coextensive with the list of people in Springfield. But Maggie had a more personal grievance. In a sequence in the episode, Burns encounters Maggie outside the Simpson home and, absorbed in his villainous monologue, literally grabs a lollipop from her. It's played as a throwaway gag. Burns is so wicked that he'd take candy from a baby, but look at it again. Burns takes something from Maggie directly. He looks at her, dismisses her as beneath his attention, and takes what he wants from her. If Maggie is what some theorists suspect she is, and we'll get to that in a later section tonight, because Maggie's mystery is its own sprawling territory, then this interaction is not the trivial moment it appears to be. Being dismissed, being underestimated, being robbed of something by someone who doesn't even bother to register you as a real entity. This is exactly the kind of experience that might produce exactly the kind of response Maggie produced. The gun was in her stroller. This is explained in the episode She'd Found It, as babies find things, but the logistics are worth examining. How does a gun end up in the stroller of a baby in a cartoon Springfield? The show's relationship with firearms is one of its more interesting ongoing negotiations. Guns appear frequently, treated with the casual American familiarity the show observes in so many aspects of its cultural landscape, but they're almost never the center of serious narrative attention. Except once. Except the night someone shot Mr. Burns. The investigation in the 7th season premiere is structured like a genuine detective story. Chief Wiggum leads the inquiry. Various suspects are examined, clues are followed and misinterpreted. It's one of the funniest and most cleverly plotted episodes in the show's history. But the resolution is, arguably, too tidy. The accident explanation dispatches the moral complexity too cleanly. A baby pulled the trigger by accident. No one is responsible. Everyone goes home. What if the show was protecting Maggie? This is the part of the theory that feels most interesting as a piece of narrative analysis rather than fan speculation. Shows protect their most beloved characters. They give them outs. They find ways to resolve potentially dark character moments, moments that might fundamentally change how viewers relate to a character in ways that preserve the character's innocence. Maggie shooting someone on purpose would be a permanently dark addition to her character. It would change her, in the viewer's mind, from a sweet background presence to something more complicated. And the show, which loves Maggie, which uses Maggie's silences to say things the louder characters can't, might have chosen to protect her from that complication. The accident explanation lets Maggie stay mysterious, lets her stay sweet. Lets her continue to observe Springfield from her stroller with those enormous eyes, knowing everything and saying nothing. But here's the lingering question. If it was an accident, why does she look so certain? Watch the shooting scene again. Watch the way Maggie's hand tightens. Watch the direction of her gaze. Whatever the episode says happened, the image tells a slightly different story. And in Springfield, where so much meaning is carried in images rather than dialogue, the image might be the more reliable source. There's another wrinkle in the Burns shooting mystery that rarely gets the attention it deserves: the gun itself. In the aftermath of the shooting, the gun is examined. It has a specific make and model. It has fingerprints on it, presumably Maggie's, given the resolution, but the fingerprint evidence is handled somewhat loosely in the episode. And there's a moment, easy to miss, in which the gun's origin is touched upon but not fully explained. Where does a baby get a gun? The show gives us a funny answer and moves on. But if you accept the premise that the shooting was not an accident that it was, in whatever sense is possible for a cartoon infant, an act of will, then the question of the gun's provenance becomes more interesting. Someone would have had to supply it, whether knowingly or not. Someone would have had to leave it accessible in a way a baby could find. Was anyone setting this up? Was anyone, somewhere in Springfield, hoping that something would happen to Mr. Burns and arranging circumstances in a way that might allow for it? These questions can't be answered from the text of the show. They're the kind of questions the show invites through atmosphere rather than evidence. But the atmosphere is undeniably there. Someone shot Mr. Burns. The show said it was Maggie. The show said it was an accident. But Springfield has always been a town where the official story and the real story have a complicated relationship. Section 5. The Immortality of Charles Montgomery Burns. Mr. Burns should be dead. This is not hyperbole or fan theory, it's a simple calculation. Mr. Burns has been established at various points over the show's run as being somewhere between 80 and over 100 years old. He was an adult during World War I, a young man during the Great Depression, and a middle-aged man during World War II. He has memories of events that span the entire 20th century. He has photographs and keepsakes and personal grudges that date back to eras that feel more like history than within living memory. And yet here he is, in his power plant, firing employees and plotting schemes and pursuing his various acquisitive obsessions with the energy, if not exactly the vigor, of a much younger man. How? The show has, characteristically, approached this question from multiple angles without ever landing on a definitive answer. There have been episodes in which Burns's physical condition is examined by doctors who react with bafflement. There is a classic episode in which a medical examination reveals that Burns has every disease known to medicine, but has so many of them simultaneously that they somehow cancel each other out, leaving him in a kind of precarious, unstable equilibrium. He is, the doctors conclude, in the rare state known as sprightly. This is one of the show's most satisfying pieces of Burns mythology, and it's funny in the way that the best Simpsons jokes are funny on the surface, and then strangely resonant when you think about it longer. Burns has every disease, and yet he survives. Not because he's healthy, but because he's so thoroughly diseased that the diseases can't quite get purchase on him. It's a metaphor for something. Perhaps for the way that a certain kind of power insulates itself against all threats by accumulating so many problems that none of them can ever be the decisive one. But the disease equilibrium, satisfying as it is, doesn't fully explain Burns's longevity. Even in perfect health, no one lives as long as Burns has lived. And Burns, whatever he is not in perfect health. So the fan theories reach for other explanations. The most popular is some form of deal, a Faustian bargain, a Mephistophelian arrangement, a transaction with forces that operate outside the normal laws of biology and time. The show has, occasionally, flirted with supernatural elements. There have been episodes involving the devil, involving God, involving entities that suggest Springfield exists in a universe where the metaphysical is accessible in ways it isn't in ordinary reality. Burns, in this reading, made a deal somewhere in the depths of the 20th century. His vast wealth, his extraordinary power, his ability to bend institutions to his will, none of this came without cost. The cost was already paid, long ago. What he received in return was time. And yet Burns doesn't seem like a man who has found peace in his extended years. He's not serene. He's not wise in the way that fictional ancient figures often are. He's specifically, persistently, almost compulsively grasping. More money, more power, more control, more things taken from more people. Whatever deal he made, if any deal was made, it doesn't seem to have satisfied him. This is interesting because it's so psychologically coherent. If you had unlimited time, what would you do with it? Burns's answer seems to be more of the same. He scales, but he doesn't change. He accumulates but doesn't transform. The extra decades, the extra century, perhaps haven't given him perspective. They've just given him more time to be exactly who he already was. There's a loneliness to this reading of Burns that the show occasionally acknowledges. He is surrounded by servants and employees, but he has no real companions. He has Smithers, his devoted assistant, whose loyalty is one of the show's more quietly poignant ongoing stories. Smithers loves Burns in a way that Burns can barely register because Burns doesn't have the emotional vocabulary for that kind of devotion. He's lived too long in the mode of power and acquisition to relate to something as modest as genuine affection. His one real relationship that seems to operate on anything like an emotional level is with the Simpson family, or more specifically with Homer, and that relationship is itself a mystery. Burns should have fired Homer years ago. Should have fired him in the first season, given the catalog of disasters Homer has caused at the plant. Should have fired him and probably pursued legal action and definitely ensured that Homer never worked in the nuclear industry again. And yet, Homer keeps his job. He's fired sometimes and rehired. He's threatened sometimes, and then the threat dissipates. The relationship between the most powerful man in Springfield and the most chronically incompetent employee persists through everything. Why? The most generous interpretation is that Burns, in some dim and unacknowledged way, recognizes something in Homer. Perhaps recognizes what he himself might have been in some alternate version of his long life if he hadn't made the choices he made. Homer is the anti-Burns, warm where Burns is cold, careless where Burns is calculating, loved where Burns is feared. Homer has things, a family, a community, a connection to the ordinary human world that Burns gave up a long time ago in exchange for power. Keeping Homer around might be a way of keeping that world visible, like a window in a sealed room. But there's another theory about Burns's longevity that's darker and more specific, and it connects back to the power plant and the environmental theories we explored earlier. What if Burns's survival isn't supernatural? What if it's chemical? The plant has been running for decades. Burns has been in it for decades longer than anyone else. He's been exposed to whatever the plant produces at higher doses, and for longer than any other character in the show. And if the theory about Springfield's radiation creating some kind of altered biological state has any traction, if there's something in the plant's output that interacts with human biology in unusual ways, then Burns would be the most thoroughly affected person in Springfield. He built the plant. He's been inside it, essentially, since the beginning. The radiation, whatever it does to ordinary Springfieldians in small doses, has been working on Burns in large doses for a very long time. Maybe it's not a deal with the devil that keeps him alive. Maybe it's a long and inadvertent form of self-exposure. Maybe the plant doesn't just power Springfield, maybe it powers Burns. This would explain why he never seems to consider retiring. Why he's never seriously tempted to step back from the plant and its operations. Why his health, precarious as it is, always seems to stabilize when he's in or near the plant's environment. He needs it, not because he's addicted in any ordinary sense, but because it has become, over decades, part of his biology. He and the plant are not separate entities anymore. They are, in some fundamental way, the same organism. Which means that when the show periodically threatens to shut down the plant through legal action, through regulation, through the consequences of one of its many catastrophic safety failures, it's not just threatening Burns's income, it's threatening Burns's life. And Burns knows this, which explains, perhaps better than anything else, why he fights so hard to keep it running. Not just for money, not just for power, but because the plant is, quite literally, keeping him alive. Section 6. Maggie Simpson and the Silent Strategy. We've circled around Maggie twice now tonight, once in the context of Mr. Burns' shooting, and briefly in our earlier explorations of the family dynamic. But Maggie Simpson deserves her own sustained attention, because she is, arguably, the show's most carefully constructed mystery. She is the character who appears in the most episodes. She is the character who has changed the least over 35 years. She is the character about whom the least has been said, and the most has been shown. And she is the character whose interior life the show most consistently invites the viewer to imagine, without ever fully revealing it. She doesn't speak. This is the foundational fact of Maggie's characterization, and it's worth thinking about seriously rather than taking for granted. Other cartoon babies have spoken. Rugrats was built entirely on the premise of articulate infants. Family Guy's Stewie speaks in complete sentences, and his speech is one of the defining elements of his character. Even within The Simpsons itself, Maggie has spoken in specific episodes, in specific circumstances, sometimes just once or twice per decade, in ways that suggest she can speak but has chosen not to. This is an important distinction. There are characters who are silent because they're incapable of speech, and then there are characters who are silent because they've decided something. Maggie, the evidence suggests, has decided something. The first time Maggie speaks, the very first word uttered by the youngest Simpson was in a 1992 episode in which she says "daddy" as her first word. It's a single syllable. It's tender. It's one of the most quietly emotional moments in the show's early run. And then she doesn't speak again for years. Over the subsequent decades, Maggie speaks occasionally, usually at the end of an episode, usually in a moment of emotional weight, usually voiced by an actress of some cultural significance. Elizabeth Taylor voiced Maggie's first daddy. Other notable names have voiced specific Maggie lines over the years. The show treats Maggie's speech as an event, something that requires special handling, special attention, special investment. Why? Why is a baby's speech treated this way? One possibility is that the show is simply extending a running gag to its maximum possible duration, saving Maggie's voice for special occasions to preserve the comedic potential of the delay. This is a legitimate creative choice, and it's probably part of the calculation. But there's another reading that's more interesting. What if Maggie knows what speaking would cost her? Consider what Maggie has going for her as a non-speaking character. She is everywhere. She observes everything. She moves through Springfield's stories like a silent witness, present in the background of scenes that aren't about her, watching events unfold from her stroller or playpen or high chair. The adults around her don't modify their behavior for her presence, because they've essentially filed her under too young to understand. But she understands. The show has demonstrated this repeatedly, in moments where Maggie's response to events is clearly too knowing, too specific, too precisely targeted to be infantile instinct. She watches. She calculates. She waits. If Maggie spoke, if she entered into the conversational economy of Springfield as a participant rather than an observer, she would lose her access to those unguarded moments. Adults edit themselves around children who can talk back. They perform for them, explain to them, try to shape what they understand. But around a baby who seems to be simply occupying space, they say the real things. Maggie has spent years in the position of the person to whom the real things are said. What has she learned? This is the question the show has never answered, and perhaps never will. But the accumulation of what Maggie has witnessed, if we track it across 3+ decades, is extraordinary. She has been present for family crises, for marital tensions, for Homer's worst moments and best moments, for Bart's schemes and Lisa's intellectual awakenings. She has been in the room when things were said that weren't meant for anyone to hear. And she remembers. The show has hinted at this. There are moments where Maggie's expressions suggest a comprehension and retention that exceed what her apparent age should allow. This brings us to one of the more speculative theories about Maggie, that she is not, in any meaningful sense, a normal baby. The floating timeline means that Maggie has been an infant for over 30 years. This is usually explained the same way Bart's perpetual 10ness is explained. Cartoon stasis, the demands of format. Don't think about it too hard. But what if, for Maggie specifically, there's something more intentional going on? What if Maggie's babyhood isn't a result of the show's format? What if it's a choice that Maggie is making? This sounds impossible, but the show has laid groundwork for it in surprising ways. There have been future episodes set in an imagined version of Springfield's future in which the Simpson children have grown up. Bart and Lisa age, change, develop. Maggie, in these future visions, is either conspicuously absent, or depicted as significantly older, or depicted in ways that emphasize how much she's changed from her infant self. But in the present of the show, she stays. She holds her position. She observes. What would motivate this if it were a choice? The same motivation that explains the silence: access. A baby has access to things a child doesn't. A baby is allowed into rooms where children wouldn't be. A baby is carried everywhere, passed from arm to arm, present for conversations and events that happen in the peripheral spaces of adult life. If Maggie has something she needs to understand, if there's some knowledge she's pursuing that requires this level of access, then staying a baby is the most rational strategy available to her. What is she looking for? We don't know, but the shooting of Mr. Burns might be a clue. Because whatever else that moment was, accident or intention, self-defense or cold calculation, it demonstrated that Maggie, when pushed, acts. She doesn't just observe. When something crosses a line that she's drawn in her silent interior, she responds. The question that hangs over Maggie's story, unanswered across all these years, is, what line hasn't been crossed yet? What is she waiting for? What will it take for the observing to end and the real action to begin? The show doesn't tell us. It keeps Maggie in her stroller, her eyes open, her mouth around her pacifier, watching, waiting. Section 7. Mona Simpson, the ghost in the machine. Homer's mother appears in the show as an absence before she appears as a presence. For most of its first several seasons, The Simpsons treats Homer's mother as simply gone. He grew up without her. She left when he was young. The specific circumstances are never fully specified in the early episodes, just a hovering absence, the way a missing parent hovers over a child's entire life even when the child never speaks about it directly. And then she comes back. The episode in which Mona Simpson returns is one of the most emotionally significant episodes the show ever produced, which is saying something, given how many significant episodes the show has over 35 seasons. She comes back not as a returned housewife or a woman who simply walked away, but as something more specific and more complicated. As a former radical, a 1960s activist, a woman who has spent decades on the run from the law following an act of protest that Mr. Burns manipulated into a criminal charge, Mona didn't leave Homer. She was driven away by the consequences of her politics and, more specifically, by the intervention of the same man who now employs Homer at the power plant. This is, if you trace it carefully, one of the show's most extraordinary connections. The villain who looms over Homer's adult professional life is the same man who destroyed Homer's family when Homer was a child. Burns took Homer's mother. Burns gave Homer a job. Homer has spent his entire adult life in the orbit of the man who, more than anyone else, shaped the wound at the center of his childhood. And Homer, for the most part, doesn't quite see it, or can't quite hold it together as a single coherent narrative, or has found some way to keep these two facts in separate compartments of his mind. This is, psychologically, very human. The way trauma and ordinary life coexist in a person, the way someone can work for their abuser without fully articulating that relationship to themselves, is one of the more quietly devastating things about the Mona Simpson storyline. But let's focus on the mystery of Mona herself. She is a woman who, by the time we meet her, has been in hiding for decades. She has lived under assumed names. She has moved constantly. She has maintained contact with her son only through the most careful and intermittent means, because any contact could lead Burns or his associates to find her. How has she survived this? Who has helped her? The show gives us glimpses of other former activists, a network of people who remember what she stood for and protect her for that reason, but the full architecture of Mona's underground life is never fully mapped. And here's what's interesting. She is not, by the time Homer finds her, broken by it. She is tired, certainly. She has missed her son's entire life, missed Homer growing up and becoming a father and building the imperfect but genuine life he's built. She has missed Bart and Lisa and Maggie. She has missed so much. But she is not defeated. She is still, in some fundamental sense, herself. Still the woman who threw a sabotage wrench into Burns's factory because she believed it was the right thing to do. Still politically engaged, still morally alive, still connected to her own sense of purpose. This is, in the context of The Simpsons, unusual. The show tends to be somewhat cynical about idealism. Springfield's civic life is a graveyard of good intentions, and characters who begin with high-minded goals tend to find those goals gradually worn down by the friction of ordinary life. But Mona doesn't seem worn down. The decades of hiding have, if anything, concentrated her. The mystery that surrounds Mona is partly about what she knows. A woman who has been paying attention to Charles Montgomery Burns for 30 years, who has had reason to track him, to understand his operations, to know things about him that the general public and the regulatory agencies have never been told would know things. She would know about the plant's actual safety record in ways that never made it into official reports. She would know about Burns's real political connections, the ones that keep the NRC from ever following through on its inspections. She would know about the history of the plant's environmental impact, the things that happened before Blinky, the three-eyed fish, the earlier incidents that were successfully suppressed. Does Mona share this knowledge with anyone before she dies? The show suggests she does, in pieces, but the pieces are given to various characters and never quite assembled into a complete picture. The larger mystery of Mona Simpson is the mystery of the political generation she represents. She belongs to a cohort of Americans who believed, in the 1960s, that things could be fundamentally changed, that corporations could be held accountable, that power could be redistributed, that the systems causing harm could be reformed or replaced. Some members of that generation burned out quickly. Some found accommodation with the systems they'd opposed. Some kept going, underground or above ground, sustained by a commitment that didn't depend on success for its fuel. Mona kept going, underground but going. What does it mean that this woman, this particular woman, with this particular history, is Homer Simpson's mother? What did she give him in the years before she had to leave that has persisted in him without his full awareness? Homer is not political. Homer is barely civic-minded. Homer is the opposite of his mother in almost every measurable way. And yet there are moments, quiet, occasional, easy to miss, when Homer does the right thing, not for any calculated reason, but because something in him recognizes that it's right. When he defies Burns, not because he's thought it through, but because something pulls him. Maybe that's Mona. Maybe the years she spent with him before she had to go were enough to plant something in him that the rest of his life hasn't quite managed to extinguish. Not politics, not ideology, but something simpler and more durable, a compass. It doesn't always point true, but it's there. Section 8. The Simpsons predictions. What they actually mean. There is a list. If you've spent any time on the internet in the last 20 years, you've encountered some version of it. The Simpsons, the list claims, predicted this event and this other event, sometimes years or even decades before it happened. The show predicted smartphones. It predicted smartwatches. It predicted a specific kind of video calling technology. It predicted political outcomes. It predicted sports results. It predicted technological developments. The list is real. Not every item on it holds up under scrutiny, and some of the more dramatic claims are the result of selective quotation and creative editing. But a significant core of it is genuinely accurate. The show, at specific points in its history, depicted things that later came to pass. How? There are several layers to this question, and tonight we're going to move through them slowly, because the most interesting layer is not the one that gets the most attention. The first and most boring explanation is statistics. The Simpsons has been running for 35 years and has produced hundreds of episodes. It has depicted enormous amounts of cultural and technological and political content. Given enough attempts, some predictions were inevitable. If you write about the future often enough, you'll sometimes be right. This is true, and it's important context, and it's not particularly interesting. The second explanation is that the show's writers were genuinely prescient, that they were thinking seriously about the future of technology, politics, and culture, and their informed extrapolations sometimes hit accurately. This is more interesting. The Simpsons has always attracted brilliant writers, and brilliant people who think carefully about where things are going sometimes see around corners. This explains some of the predictions, but there's a third explanation that's more interesting than either of the first two, and it's not the supernatural one that circulates in meme culture. The third explanation is that The Simpsons didn't predict the future, it shaped it. Consider the prediction about the three-eyed fish. That image fish with extra eyes, living in the river near a nuclear plant, existed in the public consciousness for years before specific incidents of mutation in fish populations near industrial facilities were documented and publicized. Did the show predict those mutations? Or did the show's satirical treatment of industrial pollution help create the cultural climate in which such mutations were noticed, reported, and taken seriously as a public concern? This is a chicken and egg problem, but it's a real one. Culture shapes perception. What we've seen depicted, especially in something we've watched since childhood, something that's part of the furniture of our mental landscape, changes what we notice and what we consider important. The Simpsons may not have predicted some of its hits, so much as it planted images and concepts that later found their way, in roundabout ways, into the culture. Consider the political predictions. The show depicted a future President Trump in an episode from 2000, in a context of American economic decline. When Trump actually became president in 2016, the image circulated widely and took on a kind of prophetic quality. But is it possible that the joke, broadcast to millions of people across multiple rerun cycles over 16 years, contributed even marginally to the cultural normalization of the idea of a celebrity president? That seeing the idea depicted, even satirically, made it fractionally more imaginable to people who might otherwise have rejected it as impossible? This is not a causal claim in any strong sense. It's a softer suggestion that the predictions worked, in some cases through feedback loops rather than foresight. The show depicted things. People saw the depictions. The depictions became part of how people understood possibilities. Some of those possibilities were subsequently realized, partly because they'd been depicted. But there's a fourth layer, which is the strangest one. Some of the predictions are specific enough and accurate enough that simple statistics and cultural influence don't adequately explain them. Some of the show's apparent foresight involves details specific configurations of technology, specific political circumstances, specific event sequences that seem too precise to be explained by broad satirical extrapolation. For these predictions, theorists have reached for an explanation that sounds absurd but is worth articulating carefully. The writers weren't predicting the future. They were receiving information about it. From where? From whom? Here is where the theory tends to dissolve into unfalsifiable speculation. But the most coherent version involves something relatively mundane and genuinely interesting. The writers of The Simpsons, over the decades, have maintained extensive connections with people in Silicon Valley, in politics, in finance, in the research communities where the actual future gets developed. These people, speaking casually to writers who were building a comedy show about American life, shared information about what was being developed and planned information that hadn't yet been made public. And the writers, translating that inside knowledge into satire, sometimes depicted it with a precision that looked, years later, like prophecy. This would mean the predictions aren't magic. They're journalism, of a very specific kind, the kind that trades on access to the rooms where decisions get made, filtered through the sensibility of people whose job is to make that access funny. If this is true, it changes how we read the show's relationship with the future. Not as a prophet's vision, but as a chronicler's report notes from the rooms where tomorrow is being built, translated into animated comedy. And if the show has been reporting on the future since 1989, what does that make all the things it hasn't yet depicted? What are the blank spaces in Springfield's story that are still waiting to be filled in? What hasn't happened yet that the show already knows about? These questions sit at the edge of what's answerable. But sitting with them, here in the quiet of late night, it's hard not to feel something like wonder, not at the show's supernatural gifts, but at the very human fact that sometimes, if you pay attention to the right things and ask the right questions and find the right people to talk to, you can see far enough ahead that it looks, from a distance, like magic. Section 9. Hans Moleman, the man who cannot die. There is a minor character in The Simpsons who has died more times than any other character in the history of American television. His name is Hans Moleman. He is short, visually impaired, ancient-seeming despite a claimed age of 31, and possessed of a voice that sounds like an apology. He drives slowly. He makes terrible choices. He exists, apparently, specifically to suffer the consequences of those choices in increasingly elaborate ways. Hans Moleman has been crushed, burned, buried alive, struck by vehicles, electrocuted, drowned, pecked by birds, trampled, launched into space, consumed by various creatures, and subjected to medical procedures of dubious benefit. He has been in situations of mortal peril more times than any casual viewer of the show would be able to count, and he has died clearly, definitively, in ways that leave no room for survival dozens of times across the show's history. And yet he keeps appearing. This is, on its face, the simplest kind of cartoon logic. Background characters don't die, they reset, because they're scenery rather than protagonists. Every time the show needs a resident of Springfield to suffer some consequence, Molman is available. He's funny precisely because of his accumulated history of misfortune, and the show leverages that accumulated history in increasingly meta-aware ways as the seasons go on. But the mystery of Molman is more interesting than simple cartoon persistence, because the show itself seems to acknowledge that something unusual is happening with him. There are episodes in which characters react to Molman's survival with something like recognition, a raised eyebrow, a slight pause, a moment in which the show seems to acknowledge that this particular man's continued existence is, by any reasonable metric, inexplicable. The show knows he should be dead. The characters, occasionally, seem to know it too, and he just isn't. Why does this matter? Why spend time on a background character? Because Hans Molman is, in a very specific way, a test case for something the show is interested in across its entire run: the relationship between individual suffering and cosmic indifference. Molman suffers constantly. He suffers specifically, elaborately, repeatedly. And the universe of Springfield, which does, as we've noted, seem to have some kind of metaphysical structure, some awareness of the relationships between people and events, does absolutely nothing about it. Molman suffers, and the sun continues to rise and set, and the people of Springfield go about their business, and no one learns anything from it. In many works of fiction, suffering is meaningful. It teaches characters something. It changes them. It advances the story. In Springfield, Molman's suffering is purely absurdist. It accumulates without purpose, without lesson, without arc. This is either the cruelest thing about Springfield or the most honest. Real suffering is often like this meaningless, repetitive, unnarrated by any larger story of growth or redemption. Most people who have bad things happen to them don't transform into better versions of themselves because of it. They just have bad things happen to them. Molman represents this truth in concentrated form. He is the absurdist saint of Springfield's cosmology, a man chosen, apparently arbitrarily, to bear a disproportionate share of the universe's indifference. And yet he persists. The question of why he persists beyond the obvious, because the format requires it, is the one that generates interesting theory. Some fan readings suggest that Molman's survival is itself a kind of cosmic joke. He is being kept alive specifically to continue suffering. The universe that keeps killing him keeps reviving him because suffering requires a subject, and Molman is the designated subject. This is an uncomfortably dark reading of a background gag. But it's not entirely unsupported by the show's treatment of him. There's another reading, though, that's warmer. In this reading, Molman's survival is a kind of grace, not the product of cosmic cruelty, but of cosmic mercy. He survives everything because there is something in him, some quality the universe recognizes and protects that makes his death something that the story of Springfield simply cannot accommodate. What might that quality be? Look at how he's written. Hans Molman is almost never angry. He is almost never vengeful. He accepts his misfortunes with a melancholy equanimity that verges on sainthood. When things happen to him, terrible things that would break most people, he tends to respond with a resignation that isn't quite despair but isn't quite hope either. It's a kind of radical acceptance. Maybe the universe keeps him alive because he's the only person in Springfield who has genuinely made his peace with the universe. Everyone else in Springfield, Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Burns, Flanders, is reaching for something, struggling towards something, resisting some fundamental aspect of their situation. Molman has reached some kind of bottom that isn't despair, and from that bottom he simply endures. The universe in this reading finds this remarkable. Remarkable enough to keep him around. Or maybe, in the most literal reading possible, Hans Molman is 31 years old. He said so himself, in a specific episode, and his stated age is part of his character's absurdity. He looks and moves and sounds decades older than 31. But what if he meant it? What if he really is 31? What if whatever makes someone look and move and sound like Hans Molman has nothing to do with biological age, and Molman is simply experiencing his own version of Springfield's temporal anomaly in an unusually concentrated form? He ages without time. He suffers without accumulating damage. He dies without dying. He is, perhaps, the most Springfield resident in Springfield. Section 10. Ned Flanders, the saddest man in Springfield. Next door to the Simpsons lives a man named Ned Flanders, and he is, when examined carefully, one of the most quietly tragic figures in American television. He is presented, on the surface, as a comedy character, the foil to Homer, the too-good neighbor, the man whose cheerfulness and faith and relentless decency are played for laughs because they are so excessive, so deliberate, so sustained against all reasonable odds. Homer resents Ned. Springfield finds him irritating. The show uses him as a counterpoint to its more cynical instincts, someone to bounce the darkness off. But trace Ned Flanders' story from beginning to end, and what emerges is a portrait of a man who has been subjected to an almost unimaginable volume of personal loss and who has responded to that loss with a kind of faith that has, over the decades, started to look less like genuine belief and more like the alternative to total collapse. Ned's wife Maud dies. This is the most significant event in Ned's story, and it happens in a way that is almost gratuitously cruel. Maud Flanders is killed by t-shirt cannons at a racing event, a death so absurd, so unmotivated by any narrative logic, that it has become a touchstone in discussions of the show's casualness about the consequences of major events. She was there. Then she was gone. The show treated it as a character moment for Homer, whose distraction may have contributed to Maud being in the line of fire, more than as a genuine exploration of grief. But Ned's grief was, for a period, genuinely examined. He had to raise his sons alone. He had to continue his life in the house next to the family of the man whose indirect negligence may have contributed to his wife's death. He had to keep smiling, keep saying diddly and doodly, keep being Ned Flanders. And he did. Because the alternative to being Ned Flanders was something he couldn't allow himself to approach. Here is where the theory about Ned becomes interesting. There's a flashback episode in the show's history that reveals something crucial about Ned's childhood. He was raised by neglectful, bohemian parents who provided no structure, no rules, no discipline. As a child, Ned was deeply troubled acting out, unable to control himself, struggling in ways that made him miserable. He was treated by a psychiatrist named Dr. Foster, who subjected him to an experimental therapy that essentially compressed his entire negative emotional range, everything that a normal person might express through anger, through frustration, through complaint, through normal human dissatisfaction into a suppressed subpersonality. The therapy worked in the sense that Ned became functional. Ned became cheerful. Ned became the person everyone knows. But what happened to everything he compressed? The show has never fully answered this. There have been episodes in which the compressed Ned emerges briefly, in which the pressure gets too great, and something comes through that is not the cheerful neighbor. These moments are usually played for laughs, because the spectacle of Ned expressing genuine rage or despair is inherently comedic given his established character. But what if those moments are something more than comic relief? What if they're the structural cracks showing? What if Ned Flanders, the most relentlessly positive person in Springfield, is a man who is one serious trauma away from a comprehensive breakdown of everything he's built his identity on? Maud's death might have been that trauma. The show chose not to go there, chose to let Ned recover, to let him eventually date again, to keep him functional and cheerful and next door. But the choice not to explore what Maud's death really did to Ned feels like the show protecting itself from something too heavy to carry. Because here's what's true about Ned Flanders. His faith is his structure. His belief in God and a specific, personally engaged, watching and caring God is the architecture that holds the compressed grief and anger in place. Without the belief, there is no structure. Without the structure, there is no Ned. And faith, as the show occasionally allows itself to acknowledge, is a fragile thing. It's sustainable against normal difficulty. But the losses Ned has experienced, Maud, and the subsequent losses and setbacks accumulate into something that puts faith under more pressure than faith is usually designed to bear. What does Ned do with this? He prays more. He reads scripture more. He volunteers more. He does more, as if the doing can keep the thinking at bay. He fills his time with goodness so thoroughly that there's no space left for doubt to find a foothold. This is recognizable. This is a coping mechanism that real people use not as criticism, just as observation. When grief becomes too large to sit with, you move. You do. You serve. You remain active, because activity is the opposite of the stillness in which the grief grows. Ned moves constantly. He moves through Springfield like a man who has decided that standing still is the only thing he truly cannot afford. The show, to its credit, does acknowledge occasionally that something harder is going on under Ned's cheerfulness. There are episodes where Homer, who is not observant by nature, perceives something in Ned that others miss: a heaviness, a tiredness, a specific quality of someone who has worked very hard for a very long time to be someone they have to consciously maintain. Homer doesn't have the language for it, and he usually stumbles around it rather than addressing it directly. But he sees it. This is one of the show's most carefully maintained mysteries. The relationship between Homer and Ned is a relationship between two men who understand each other far better than they admit, and whose apparent opposition is less about genuine incompatibility than about the different forms their damage has taken. Homer's damage is visible, noisy, consequential. Ned's damage is invisible, contained, and pressed down so thoroughly that it has, over time, become indistinguishable from his character. The saddest man in Springfield is the one who won't let himself be sad. And Springfield, being Springfield, treats this as comedy, because Springfield treats everything as comedy, even the things that aren't. Section 11. Sideshow Bob, a mystery that was never really solved. If you were to list the characters in The Simpsons who operate at the highest levels of genuine menace, who are, within the show's comedic framework, genuinely threatening, Sideshow Bob would be near the top of any such list. He is a formally educated man, Tidewater Community College, and later something implied to be a proper academic background possessed of extraordinary intelligence, genuine artistic talent, and an obsessive devotion to a single goal that has consumed decades of his life. That goal is killing Bart Simpson, and yet he has never done it. He has had Bart at his mercy on multiple occasions. He has constructed elaborate schemes that came within moments of success. He has escaped from prison repeatedly, evaded law enforcement internationally, and demonstrated a capacity for planning and execution that, in any other context, would be recognized as brilliant. He just can't kill Bart. The obvious explanation is that this is a cartoon, and Bart Simpson can't die because the show can't continue without him. Sideshow Bob is a recurring antagonist whose menace depends on not quite succeeding, and the show structures his appearances accordingly. But the show itself seems to be aware of this paradox, aware that Bob's repeated failures require explanation even within the fiction, and it has offered, at various points, several explanations that are each interesting in their own way. One is pure comedy. Sideshow Bob keeps stepping on rakes. The rake gag is one of the show's most beloved absurdist extended jokes, a callback that plays on the accumulation of frustration in a way that goes beyond standard comedy. The rakes aren't random misfortune. They're the universe telling Bob something, and Bob refusing to hear it. What is the universe telling him? Perhaps something like, "This is not who you're supposed to be." The rakes are the physical manifestation of the gap between who Sideshow Bob is: cultured, brilliant, capable of genuine warmth, and what he has devoted himself to becoming. Every time a rake hits him in the face, it's the universe's feedback on his life choices. He keeps not listening. The deeper mystery of Sideshow Bob is why he hates Bart with such specific intensity. Bart was responsible for exposing Bob's framing of Krusty, Bob's first great scheme, and the one that sent him to prison in the first place. This is the proximate cause of the hatred. But the intensity of the hatred, the decades-long obsession, the way it has consumed and organized Bob's entire adult life, seems disproportionate to what Bart actually did. Bart didn't ruin Bob's life maliciously. Bart was a 10-year-old child who noticed that something was wrong. He noticed specific details: the fact that Bob had enormous feet that shouldn't have fit the shoes left at the crime scene, and reported what he noticed. He acted with the unconscious moral instinct of someone who hasn't yet learned to look away from wrongness. What Bob hates about Bart might not be what Bart did. It might be what Bart is. The kind of person whose instinct toward justice is so unreflective that it cuts through Bob's careful construction of himself. Bob spent enormous energy becoming a particular kind of person: educated, refined, capable of high culture, and a 10-year-old with no formal training saw through it immediately and didn't care. The humiliation isn't being caught. The humiliation is being caught by Bart. This reading makes Bob a more sympathetic figure, which is probably intentional. The show has spent considerable narrative energy over the decades, elaborating on who Bob actually is, his family background, his genuine aesthetic sensibilities, His capacity for love and creativity and something approaching grace when he's not obsessing about murder. He has a wife. He has a son. He has, in certain episodes, the outline of a genuinely good life that he keeps walking away from in order to pursue his vendetta. Why does the vendetta matter more than the good life? This is the mystery that the show has circled without solving. The vendetta has become Bob's identity. Who is Sideshow Bob when he's not trying to kill Bart Simpson? The show has occasionally explored this. There's a remarkable episode in which Bob actually does kill Bart inside a time loop over and over again and finds that succeeding doesn't give him what he wanted. He kills Bart and feels nothing but emptiness. The villain who achieves his goal finds that the goal was never what he actually wanted. What did Bob want? What does any person want who has built their entire sense of self around a single consuming ambition? They want the ambition to give them meaning. They want the goal to make the life feel purposeful. And when it turns out the goal was never going to do that, when it turns out that meaning can't be acquired through revenge, the only options are to keep going anyway or to start over. Bob keeps going. He has been keeping going for decades. Each escape from prison, each new scheme, each encounter with Bart and the resulting failure is another lap around a circuit he can see the whole shape of, but can't stop running. The mystery of Sideshow Bob is the mystery of someone who chose who they were going to be at a moment of anger and humiliation, and has been unable to revise that choice despite mountains of evidence that it was the wrong one. Springfield, with its characteristic generosity toward damaged people, keeps letting him try again. The rakes keep hitting him in the face. He keeps not stopping. Section 12. The final thread, every mystery points to the same place. We've traveled a long way through Springfield tonight. We've walked its impossible streets and stood outside its glowing power plant, and sat quietly in its houses, while the characters said things they didn't quite mean and meant things they didn't quite say. We've looked at the frozen clocks and the floating timeline, and the shooting of Mr. Burns and the silence of Maggie Simpson, and the faith of Ned Flanders and the obsession of Sideshow Bob. And now, here in the quiet of this last section, I want to offer something that isn't exactly a solution to the mysteries because the mysteries don't have solutions, or at least not the kind that fit neatly into words, but is more like a way of seeing them together. A thread that runs through everything we've discussed. The thread is this. Springfield is a story about people who can't quite leave. Homer can't leave his job, even though his job is at a plant run by a man who has spent decades poisoning his town and who once drove away his mother. He could leave. The show has explored, over the years, dozens of alternative career paths for Homer. He's been a food critic, a professional bowler, a grease entrepreneur, a music promoter. He always comes back to Sector 7G. He always comes back to the desk he never quite manages to maintain, to the job that is simultaneously his prison and his comfort. Marge can't leave Homer. She has had reasons across 35 years that would justify leaving. The show has brought her to the edge of that choice more than once, and each time she has stepped back, not because the show is endorsing staying in difficult relationships as an absolute good, the writers are too sophisticated for that, but because Marge's commitment to her family is one of the show's most carefully examined moral phenomena. She has considered leaving. She has come back. The reasons she gives are sometimes inadequate to the weight of what she's staying through, and the show knows it and doesn't resolve the tension. She just stays. Bart can't leave being Bart. This sounds trivially true. He's a cartoon character. He doesn't change, but within the fiction of the show, Bart has had moments of real potential for transformation. He has shown intelligence, empathy, creativity, and moral insight. He has had teachers who recognized him as something more than his reputation. He has had relationships with Milhouse, with various girls he's liked, with Lisa at her most vulnerable that opened in him capacities he usually keeps locked away. And then, every time he closes back up, he becomes Bart again. Because Bart doesn't know how to be anything else, and Springfield doesn't know what to do with a version of him that isn't this. Lisa can't leave her standards. She is, by any measure, too good for Springfield, too intelligent, too artistically sensitive, too politically aware, too interested in the world beyond the town's limits. And yet here she is, still in the second grade, still in the same school, still surrounded by people who can't quite meet her where she lives. She has had opportunities to go to attend better schools, to connect with people who match her intellectually, and they have always resolved back into Springfield. She stays because the family holds her, Because the bonds of love are, for Lisa, more powerful than the call of elsewhere. These are not failures. They are the condition of being human. The way love and habit and fear and affection and identity all entangle in ways that make leaving the people and places we know genuinely difficult, even when we have every reason in the world to try. What Springfield does is make this condition visible. It makes it visible by extending it by taking the normal human tendency to stay in known places with known people and stretching it across decades until the staying becomes impossible to miss and impossible to explain away. Why do people stay in Springfield? The same reasons people stay anywhere. Because the familiar is comfortable, even when it's difficult. Because the people who know you, even imperfectly, even frustratingly, are precious in ways that strangers can't be. Because leaving means becoming someone new, and becoming someone new requires losing, at least partially, whoever you are now. And we like who we are, even when we know we should change. Even when staying is costing us something. There is a theory, one of the more beautiful theories about The Simpsons, in my view, that the show's real subject has never been the satire. The social commentary, the political jokes, the celebrity parodies, these are the surface. The show's real subject is ordinary American love. The love between people who are imperfect, who make each other crazy, who sometimes fail each other in significant ways but who keep showing up anyway, who can't leave, who choose, again and again, the specific difficulty of these specific people over the theoretical cleanness of somewhere else. Homer loves Marge in a way that is impossible to articulate and also impossible to miss, even through all the stupidity and the accidents and the moments where he got it profoundly wrong. He loves her. He loves his children. He loves the house on Evergreen Terrace with its impossible floor plan and its stubborn exterior. He loves Springfield. God help him. With all its corruption and its pollution and its casual cruelty to its own residents. He loves it because it's his. Because it's where his life is. Because love doesn't require a place to be good in order to be genuine. And that, perhaps, is the final mystery of Springfield, the one that underlies all the others. Not how Maggie stayed a baby for 30 years. Not why Molman keeps surviving. Not who burned the town or shot the villain or built the device to block the sun. The final mystery is this. Why, after 35 years, do we keep coming back? Why do we return to this town, this family, these stories we've heard hundreds of times, these characters we know by heart? What is it that Springfield gives us that makes us want to sit with it again, on a late night or a quiet afternoon, when the world has been too loud and we need something familiar? Maybe it's the same thing the characters are looking for. The warmth of known things. The comfort of a place where, no matter what happens, everyone ends up back at the same address. Where the couch is always there, where the family is always waiting. There is no couch that can hold them all, not really, not for long, and yet they keep landing on it. And we keep watching them land. Because Springfield is not just a cartoon town. Springfield is the part of us that needs things to stay the same even as everything changes. That needs a place to return to. That needs to know, somewhere in the imagination, that there is a house with yellow walls and a worn couch and a family that bickers and forgives and bickers again and is there, always there, every time you need them. The mysteries of Springfield are real mysteries, but they are mysteries in the service of something that isn't mysterious at all. They are the elaborate decoration around something very simple, very human, and very true. The family keeps coming home, and so do we. Good night, Springfield. Good night, wherever you are tonight. If these mysteries kept you company through the dark hours, we're glad for it, and if you'd like to keep exploring, you know where to find us. End of script. Total approximate word count. 42,000 plus words. Expanded sections deep dives. Extended section 1. The town that time forgot going deeper. Let's return to the floating timeline, because there is more to say about it than our first pass allowed. When you spend time with the timeline problem, really sit with it. Trace it episode by episode across the decades, it stops feeling like a production quirk and starts feeling like a philosophical position. Like the show has an actual argument to make about time, and is making it through structure rather than dialogue. Consider what a timeline does. In any piece of storytelling, it anchors characters to consequence. If Bart does something in episode 40 and the show acknowledges it in episode 41, then Bart's actions have weight. They echo. They become part of who he is and how other characters relate to him. The timeline is, essentially, the mechanism through which characters grow. The Simpsons, in its floating timeline, refuses this mechanism almost entirely. Bart does not become the sum of his pranks. Homer does not accumulate wisdom from his catastrophes. Marge does not develop the specific kind of patience that comes from having endured particular trials. Each episode begins from a baseline that is essentially identical to the baseline of every other episode, and the events of previous episodes are either forgotten entirely or referenced only in the most glancing, superficial way. This is, most television scholars would tell you, the episodic format. This is how television worked for most of its history. Series television before the era of prestige drama in the late 1990s and early 2000s was built almost entirely on this model. Each episode is self-contained, the characters reset at the end, and the audience can watch in any order without losing crucial context. The Simpsons was a product of that era. It was built on that model. This is the simple explanation. But here's what's strange. Around the same time that prestige drama was establishing the model of the serialized arc, around the time that The Sopranos and The Wire, and later Breaking Bad, were redefining what long-form television storytelling could do, The Simpsons explicitly chose not to evolve. It had been on the air long enough to have made a different choice. It had the cultural capital, the audience loyalty, the creative talent to attempt something more serialized, more willing to let its characters change. It didn't. Why not? The official answers are practical. The format works. The audience expects it. You don't fix what isn't broken. These are real considerations. But there's another answer that the show itself seems to gesture toward in its more self-aware moments. What would it mean for Bart to grow up? This question gets asked explicitly in several flash-forward episodes that imagine a future version of Springfield where the children have aged and the parents have gotten older and time has, at last, been allowed to move normally. These episodes are among the most tonally striking the show has ever produced. They have a specific emotional texture that the regular episodes lack. A wistfulness, a quality of looking back that suggests the show knows exactly what it's giving up by keeping the timeline frozen. In the future episodes, Bart is a failure. This is not played cruelly. The show loves Bart too much for cruelty, but it's honest. The boy who coasted on charm and chaos, and a kind of feral intelligence that never quite found a productive form, has become an adult who coasted on charm and chaos, with diminishing returns. He's still likable. He's still recognizably Bart, but he hasn't become anyone new, because he was never given the tools to become anyone new. In the future episodes, Lisa has become someone a politician, a professional, a woman of achievement, and still considerable idealism. But she's also, in some of these futures, alone in ways that ache. She outgrew Springfield. She went somewhere else. And the going somewhere else cost her something that the show doesn't fully name but makes you feel. In the future episodes, Maggie is either absent or depicted in ways that preserve her mystery older but still somehow opaque, still somehow more than she appears. Whatever Maggie's future is, the show treats it as information too significant to just hand over in a flash forward. What these future visions tell us is that the show knows exactly what it's choosing not to do. It has thought through the implications of the floating timeline. It has imagined, in some detail, what Springfield would look like if time moved normally, and it has decided again and again that this is not the story it wants to tell. The story it wants to tell is something more like, what if the stakes were always the same? What if every Sunday was just another Sunday? What if the emergency was always over by the end of the episode, and the family was always intact and the morning always came after the night? What if the story had no ending? This is an unusual artistic choice. Almost all stories have endings, or at least point toward endings. The engine of narrative is usually the sense that things are building towards something, that the characters are moving through time in a direction that will eventually arrive somewhere. Remove the ending, remove the direction, and what you have is something more like a ritual than a story. Something you return to not to find out what happens, but to experience the experience of it again. Springfield is a ritual. We return to it the way people return to religious observances, not to learn something new, but to be in the presence of something known. The couch gag, the opening theme, Homer in the power plant, Homer at the bar, Homer in the house. These are not narrative beats, they are liturgical elements. They tell us where we are. They confirm that the world is still in order, that the family is still together, that the story has not yet ended. And perhaps this is why the floating timeline generates so much theorizing. Because theories are a way of introducing the ending that the show refuses to provide. The coma theory ends when Homer wakes up, or doesn't. The mutation theory ends when the plant is shut down, or isn't. The immortality theory ends when Burns finally dies, or keeps going. The theories are all, in some sense, people writing endings for a story that declines to have one, which is, of course, why they never get confirmed. If the show confirmed one of these theories, if it said, yes, Homer is in a coma, yes, the radiation is the answer, yes, this is what's really going on, then the story would have an ending. And once it had an ending, it would have to end. And Springfield can't end. Not yet. Maybe not ever. This is the deepest level of the floating timeline mystery. The show doesn't age its characters not because it can't, but because aging is a form of ending. And Springfield, like all the best rituals, like all the most beloved fictional places, is fighting against its own ending with every episode. It's not winning, exactly. 35 years have passed in the real world. The writers who created it are older now or gone. The audience that grew up with it is middle-aged or older. The culture that produced it has changed in ways that Springfield has tried, with varying success, to reflect. But Springfield endures. Bart remains 10. And every Sunday night, or whenever you find yourself returning to it, as you may be right now, the story begins again at the same place. The couch, the family, the home. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's, in the end, everything. Extended Section 2. The Nuclear Conspiracy. The Deeper Architecture. When we talked about the power plant earlier tonight, we focused on the environmental implications on what the plant has done and is doing to the physical landscape of Springfield and the bodies of its residents. But there's a second dimension to the nuclear conspiracy that's worth exploring at some length, and it has to do not with what the plant does to bodies, but with what it does to the social fabric. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not just a source of power. It is, in a very specific and traceable way, the organizing principle of Springfield's entire economy and, by extension, of its social order. Let's map this out carefully, because the map is more comprehensive than it first appears. Mr. Burns owns the plant. This is foundational. The plant generates electricity. Everyone in Springfield buys electricity. Therefore, every resident of Springfield pays, on some regular basis, a portion of their income to Mr. Burns. This is so obvious and so established that it almost disappears into the background. But think about what it means structurally. Burns has a revenue stream from every household in Springfield that is not optional and cannot be escaped. You can stop buying Duff beer. You can stop eating at Krusty Burger. You can't stop buying electricity. Not in a contemporary American town. Not in a way that allows you to continue functioning in society. Burns is not just an employer. He is, in the most literal sense, the landlord of Springfield's essential infrastructure. Now layer on top of this the employment relationship. The plant employs a significant number of Springfield's adults. Homer works there. Other named characters work there. The plant is, by the show's own accounting, one of the town's primary employers. This means that a substantial portion of Springfield's workforce depends on the plant for their income, and since the plant is owned and controlled by Burns, depends on Burns personally for their financial survival. And then layer on top of that the political relationships. Burns's wealth gives him access to politicians at every level, municipal, state, federal. He donates to campaigns, he funds initiatives. He hosts the kind of events that political figures attend and remember favorably. The regulatory agencies that are theoretically supposed to monitor the plant's safety record are staffed by people who know, in the background of their professional lives, that the plant is an important economic actor in the region and that the political figures who oversee their agencies have relationships with the plant's owner. None of this requires explicit corruption, though the show strongly implies explicit corruption in many specific instances. The structural corruption comes first, before the explicit kind. The structural corruption comes from the basic fact that Burns is rich enough and connected enough that the mechanisms designed to check his behavior cannot operate independently of his influence. This is, of course, a description of a dynamic that exists in the real world, not just in Springfield. The show's satire has always been sharpest when it's least exaggerated, when what looks like cartoonish excess is actually a slightly more colorful version of something real. But in Springfield, the pattern is unusually clear. Maybe because Springfield is small enough to see the whole pattern at once. In a real city or real region, the connections between wealth and power and infrastructure and civic life are diffuse enough that they're difficult to trace from any single vantage point. In Springfield, you can see them all at once. You can see Burns's house from the plant. You can see the plant from the school where Bart and Lisa learn. You can see the school from the bar where Homer drinks. The geography is compact enough to make the connections visible. And once the connections are visible, the question becomes, who benefits from keeping them invisible to the people inside them? Burns, obviously, but also everyone who has built their life around the stability of the existing arrangement. The people who work at the plant depend on it continuing to operate. The politicians who've taken Burns's money depend on Burns remaining viable. The regulatory agencies that have been co-opted by Burns's influence depend on the status quo not being exposed. The whole system has a kind of inertia, not just the inertia of power maintaining itself, but the inertia of everyone who has adapted their life to the existing conditions and would face disruption if those conditions changed. Homer is a perfect example of this. Homer's job is bad, by almost any measure. The working conditions are unsafe, the management is capricious and cruel. The work itself is, as far as we can tell, mostly either trivial or catastrophic, with very little in between. Homer should, on paper, want to leave this job. But leaving would mean uncertainty. Leaving would mean becoming someone different. Leaving would mean admitting that the job was never good and that he spent his adult life in it anyway, and that the reasons he stayed were ultimately about fear and habit rather than genuine attachment. This is not a comfortable set of admissions to make, so instead Homer stays. And by staying, he stabilizes the system. He's one less person challenging the arrangement. One more person whose presence at the plant normalizes the plant's continued operation. Burns understands this. Burns understands it with the particular clarity of someone who has been studying human behavior for over a century. He knows that the most reliable way to maintain a system is not to make people love it, but to make them dependent on it. To make leaving cost more than staying. To make the distance between the current arrangement and any available alternative so large that the crossing seems impossible. This is the nuclear conspiracy at its deepest level. Not the radiation, though the radiation is real. Not the safety violations, though those are real too. The deepest conspiracy is structural. The plant has been designed, whether intentionally or not, to be impossible to leave behind. Not just physically, not just because the electricity doesn't stop being necessary, but psychologically, economically, socially. Springfield is the plant. The plant is Springfield. And the architecture of that identity makes reform almost unthinkable. Almost. Because there have been moments rare, brief, quickly forgotten when someone in Springfield has looked at the whole structure and asked the obvious question, has seen the plant and the connections and the money and the capture of regulators and the exploitation of workers and said, this isn't right. These moments don't usually lead anywhere. The system is too resilient, too interconnected, too thoroughly established. The people who ask the question find themselves isolated, or co-opted, or simply ignored until the urgency fades. But they ask, and the show records it. And somewhere in the archive of Springfield's story, the moment of seeing clearly exists, even if nothing came of it. Which is, perhaps, the most realistic thing about Springfield. Not the cartoon violence, or the impossible physics, or the floating timeline. The most realistic thing is how rarely anyone has the will and the resources and the timing and the luck to actually change anything, and how they keep trying anyway. Extended Section 3. The Coma Theory, the Evidence Revisited. We discussed the coma theory earlier in our journey, and I want to return to it now with fresh eyes, because there are aspects of it that we didn't fully explore the first time, and because the theory rewards extended attention in a way that simpler theories don't. The central claim, to recap, Homer Simpson fell into a coma in the Season 4 episode, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, and he never woke up. Everything since that episode, every adventure, every guest star, every joke, is the product of Homer's dreaming, comatose mind. We talked about what this theory explains, the floating timeline, Homer's physical invincibility, the increasing surrealism of later seasons. Now let's talk about what it means for each character, taken individually. Because the coma theory, if accepted, changes the emotional register of every relationship in the show. Homer's dream Marge is, in this reading, a monument to longing. She is Homer's vision of the woman he loves, not a perfectly accurate portrait, but a deeply felt one. In Homer's dream, Marge is always beautiful, always ultimately forgiving, always returned to him no matter what the episode puts them through. She makes choices that real people don't always make. She stays, she forgives, she comes back because Homer's unconscious mind needs her to do these things. Is this fair to Marge? Is this an accurate picture of who she really is? The Marge who exists outside Homer's dream? The coma theory can't answer this, because the Marge we see is always the dream Marge. The real Marge, the woman sitting beside Homer's bed in Springfield General, watching him not wake up, is someone we never meet. We only know the version of her that Homer carries in his unconscious heart. And what Homer's unconscious heart carries, apparently, is someone who is patient beyond reasonable limits, and kind beyond what he deserves, and present beyond what the situation would ordinarily justify. Homer's dream Marge is the Marge he needs her to be, which tells us something real about Homer, about how he sees her, about how much he depends on her, about the specific shape of his love, even if it tells us nothing reliable about Marge herself. Dream Bart is Homer's guilt and his joy in equal measure. The strangling, the recurring bit in which Homer throttles Bart in response to some provocation, is one of the show's most iconic gestures, played entirely for comedy. But in the coma reading, it's something more. It's Homer's unconscious processing of his complicated relationship with his son. The frustration, the love, the fear that he's failing as a father, the pride in Bart's irrepressible spirit, the anxiety about what Bart will become, all of it gets compressed into that repeated gesture. The strangling isn't aggression. It's Homer reaching for his son, however clumsily, in the only way his dreaming mind knows how, and Bart always comes back. No matter what happens, by the end of the episode, Bart is there mischievous, resilient, essentially unchanged. Because in Homer's dream, Bart can't grow up without Homer there to watch it happen. He can't become the person he's going to be, because Homer doesn't know who that person is. He only knows the 10-year-old boy who was there when the vending machine fell. Dream Lisa is Homer's hope. She is the thing he made that is better than him, smarter, more principled, more connected to what matters. Homer doesn't fully understand Lisa in the waking world, and he doesn't fully understand her in the dream either, but there's a specific tenderness in the way the show depicts Homer's relationship with Lisa that feels like the tenderness of someone who knows they can't follow where she's going, but wants her to get there anyway. In the dream, Homer can't help Lisa be everything she could be. He doesn't have the resources or the understanding, but he dreams her as someone who is becoming it anyway, despite him and also because of him, because whatever Homer is, whatever his limitations and failures, he is genuinely on her side. The dream knows this about Homer, and it makes sure Lisa knows it too, even when the waking world relationship would struggle to articulate it. And Dream Maggie. This is where the coma theory becomes most heartbreaking. In the dream, Maggie can't age because Homer wasn't there to see her age. She's frozen at 1-year-old, the age she was when the vending machine fell, when the lights went out, when Homer stopped experiencing the world directly and began experiencing it through the filter of his dreaming mind. 1-year-old. She's been 1-year-old for 30 years. She will always be 1-year-old in Homer's dream. She will always be small enough to hold, always dependent on his protection in the ways that infants are dependent, always the baby he can carry and comfort and keep safe. Homer has a specific terror of his children needing him and him not being there. The coma has made this terror real. He isn't there. He's in a hospital bed. His children are growing up without him. And so in the dream, Maggie doesn't grow. She stays. She is always the baby, always small, always his. It is the most painful form of love, holding on to something in imagination because you can't hold on to it in reality. The coma theory, taken to its full emotional conclusion, is not a conspiracy theory or a clever narrative puzzle. It's a meditation on absence, on what happens to the mind of someone who loves their family more than anything and is suddenly, catastrophically separated from them. What the mind builds in that absence, what it holds on to, what it refuses to let change. Homer's dream is an act of devotion. And every episode that has aired since April 1993, if the theory holds, is one more night of that devotion, sustained in the dark, holding the family together in the only place Homer can still reach them, his own mind. Extended Section 4. Who shot Burns? The physical evidence. Let's go back to the crime scene. Not the narrative of the crime, we've covered that, but the physical specifics. The details of the shooting, the forensic elements the show provides, and what they actually tell us when examined carefully. Mr. Burns was shot at close range with a single bullet. The wound was not immediately fatal. He survived long enough to identify his attacker, and he survived in the long term, recovering from the wound. The gun used was a specific caliber, though the show is somewhat inconsistent about precisely which. The location of the shooting was a parking lot or outdoor area near where the town meeting took place. The circumstances, as presented in the resolution episode, are as follows. Burns encountered Maggie in this outdoor area. He attempted to take her lollipop. His gun fell from its holster, the implication being that it was dislodged by the struggle over the lollipop. Maggie picked up the gun. The gun fired, striking Burns. This is the official story. Now let's examine it against what the show actually shows us. The most fundamental problem with the official story is the gun itself. Burns carries a gun in a holster. The holster is a fairly secure method of carrying a firearm. It's designed specifically to prevent the weapon from falling out during normal movement, and even during moderate physical encounters. For a gun to fall from its holster and land in a position where a baby could pick it up and discharge it accidentally, something quite specific would need to happen. The holster would need to be defective, or the gun would need to be in a particularly loose configuration, or the encounter would need to be significantly more physical than the taking a lollipop scenario suggests. None of these possibilities are addressed or dismissed in the episode's resolution. The gun just falls. The show moves past this quickly because if you look at it too long, it gets complicated. Then there's the question of discharge. The official story presents the shooting as accidental. Maggie picked up the gun and it went off. But guns don't typically just go off when picked up. Modern firearms have multiple safety mechanisms designed specifically to prevent accidental discharge. For a gun to fire when handled by an infant who has no knowledge of firearms, who is in fact not trying to fire it, there are a limited number of explanations, and most of them require the gun to be in an unusual state of readiness. Either the safety was off, or the gun was of an unusually old design without standard safety mechanisms, or something else was going on. The shot itself was accurate. This is perhaps the most significant detail. Burns was shot cleanly, not grazed, not struck by a ricocheted bullet, not hit by random fire. The bullet struck him with enough precision to wound him seriously. Accidental discharge at close range by someone who has no training or intention typically produces wild, unpredictable results. A clean, accurate shot suggests not proves, but suggests someone who was at least trying to hit something. Now consider Maggie's size. She is, by the show's own accounting, approximately 1 year old. A 1-year-old baby holding a handgun would have difficulty gripping it, difficulty maintaining any kind of stable aim, and almost certainly no understanding of the mechanical relationship between finger pressure on a trigger and ballistic event. The image of Maggie successfully shooting Burns even accidentally requires some stretch of the imagination, unless Maggie is not, in any meaningful sense, a normal baby. We explored this in the Maggie section, and here it connects. If Maggie has the cognitive capabilities that some of her behaviors suggest, if she is observing, processing, and in some cases planning, then the shooting takes on a different character. Not accidental, not reflexive, deliberate, an action taken by someone who understood what she was doing. The alternate suspects all have their own physical evidence problems. The DNA on Burns's clothing pointed to a Simpson, and while the show eventually used this to implicate Homer before the Maggie revelation redirected things, the DNA could have pointed to any member of the family. Marge is a Simpson, Bart is a Simpson, Lisa is a Simpson, Homer is a Simpson, and anyone who had been in close physical contact with any of them could, conceivably, have transferred Simpson DNA to a crime scene through secondary contact. The physical evidence, in other words, is more ambiguous than the episode's resolution suggests. It was resolved in a way that fit the narrative, in a way that gave the audience a satisfying, unexpected answer. But the resolution was driven by story logic rather than forensic logic, which is fine. It's a cartoon, but it does mean that the mystery remains genuinely open if you're willing to question the resolution. There's one more physical detail worth noting: the position of Burns when he fell. Burns fell on the town sundial and landed with his hands pointing to letters. The show interprets this as M and S Maggie Simpson, but Burns himself acknowledged that this was not intentional. He fell, and his hands happened to land where they landed. The sundial message was not a clue. It was a coincidence. Or was it? What if Burns knew exactly what he was doing when he fell? What if the fall was not entirely involuntary? What if Burns, injured and in shock, chose specifically where to fall in order to communicate something, but chose to communicate it in a way that was deniable, in a way that could be passed off as coincidence, in a way that gave him plausible distance from whatever he was trying to say? Burns is cunning. Burns is calculating. Even in extremis, Burns would be thinking several steps ahead. What if Burns wanted the letters to be read as pointing to Maggie? What if he was protecting the real shooter by redirecting attention to someone who could never face legal consequences? And what if the person he was protecting was someone he cared about, or someone he feared, or someone whose silence he needed in exchange for his own? The mystery deepens the more you look at it. And in Springfield, the mysteries that deepen are always the ones worth returning to. Extended Section 5. Burns and Mortality, the Philosophical Dimension. We talked about Burns's physical longevity, the medical mysteries, the possible deals, the radiation theory. But there's a philosophical dimension to Burns's relationship with mortality that the show develops quietly over its run, and it deserves its own attention. Burns has watched people die. This is, for a man of his age, unavoidable. He has watched people he knew, colleagues, rivals, associates, enemies age and decline and die while he continued. He has attended funerals. He has inherited from estates. He has, presumably, navigated the emotional experience of outliving generation after generation. What does this do to a person? The show's answer, dramatized through Burns's character, is something like, it makes you very good at not caring. Not through callousness exactly. Burns has had moments that suggest an emotional capacity he usually keeps well suppressed, but through a long practice of disengagement. If you can't afford to grieve the losses because there are too many of them and they never stop, you develop mechanisms for not registering them as losses. Burns refers to the dead with a strange mixture of nostalgia and dismissal. He mentions people from his past in passing historical figures, former associates, people he encountered in various contexts during his long life with the casualness of someone referring to a passing acquaintance. These were people. Real people with lives and relationships and their own complicated interiority. And to Burns, they have become anecdotes. This is what extreme longevity does to the dead. It makes them into stories rather than people. And it makes the living into future stories people whose deaths Burns is already incorporating into his existing relationship with loss. There's a particular kind of loneliness in this. Burns is surrounded by people who will outlive him. This is the conventional assumption, the one that most of his relationships are built on, and yet he has outlived everyone he originally knew. The people who remember him as a young man are gone. The people who knew the version of him that existed before he became what he is now are gone. There is no one left who has the full context for who Charles Montgomery Burns is and how he got there. He carries that context alone. And alone is a specific kind of way to carry things. The Smithers relationship, in this light, takes on a different character than usual. Smithers is devoted to Burns in a way that is often played for comedy, the faithful servant whose devotion exceeds what the relationship calls for. But if you see Burns as a profoundly isolated man, Smithers' presence becomes something more than comedy. Smithers is, in some sense, Burns' only genuine connection, the only person who stays. The only person who chooses to be in the room not because they need something or because they're being paid, but because they want to be there. Burns doesn't always treat this well. The show is honest about this. He's dismissive of Smithers' devotion at times, exploitative of it at others, genuinely unaware of its depth on occasion. But there are moments, quieter moments, moments the show slips in without making too much of them, where Burns seems to know what he has in Smithers. Seems to understand at some level that this is the thing he can't afford to lose. The immortality question, in this philosophical dimension, isn't just how is Burns still alive? It's what has it cost him to be still alive? And the answer the show suggests is everything except the drive to continue. He has lost his peers, his personal history, his capacity for normal emotional engagement, his connection to the everyday human experience of being mortal and therefore precious. He has lost the particular quality that comes from knowing time is limited, the quality that makes choices matter, that makes relationships urgent, that makes beauty worth stopping for. Burns doesn't stop for beauty. Burns accumulates beauty. He has art, he has possessions, he has things, but he doesn't experience it the way a person experiences something they know they have limited time with. For Burns, there's always more time. More time means less urgency. Less urgency means less feeling. Less feeling means the accumulation of things rather than the experience of them. He is the richest man in Springfield and the least rich man in Springfield in the ways that might matter more. This is the show's most consistent philosophical argument, woven through every Burns appearance for 35 years. The pursuit of more, at the cost of everything else, produces a kind of winning that looks identical to a certain kind of losing. Burns wins, repeatedly, definitively, in ways that no other character in the show manages. And his winning has produced a man who glows in the dark and doesn't know his employee's name and watches the people around him die and feels, as far as we can tell, something in the vicinity of nothing. Unless he's watching Smithers. Unless something is happening in those moments that the show is too tactful to fully articulate. Maybe Burns's longevity is not the story of a man who found a way to beat mortality. Maybe it's the story of a man who found a way to survive mortality, which is different. Survival is not triumph. Survival is simply continuing after everyone else has stopped. And continuing, if you've lost enough, is its own kind of loss. Extended Section 6, Maggie the Deepest Intelligence. There's a question about Maggie Simpson that the show has never quite asked directly, but which hovers over every scene she appears in. What is she waiting for? Because Maggie is clearly waiting. The accumulated evidence of 35 years of episodes in which Maggie observes, responds to situations with uncanny precision, demonstrates problem-solving capabilities that exceed her apparent development, and maintains a silence so deliberate and consistent that it can only be interpreted as a choice. All of this points to someone in a posture of waiting, someone who has assessed the situation, developed a position, and is holding it pending some development that hasn't arrived yet. What development? To think through this seriously, you have to think about what Maggie's situation actually is. She is an infant, or appears to be in a household that does not take her seriously as an actor. She has no legal personhood in any meaningful sense. She cannot drive, cannot hold employment, cannot sign contracts, cannot own property, cannot vote. She is, in the eyes of the world, dependent on her parents for sustenance, on society for protection, on the normal developmental arc that leads from infancy to childhood to adulthood. If Maggie has the intelligence that the evidence suggests she has, she knows all of this. She knows the constraints she operates under. She knows that acting too soon before she has accumulated the resources, the legal standing, the social capital that comes with adulthood would be ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. A baby who shoots a billionaire gets written off as an accident. A young adult who exposes a billionaire's criminal conspiracy is a whistleblower. Maggie is playing the long game. She always has been. And the long game, for someone with her patience and her intelligence, is simply a matter of waiting until the conditions are right. The question is what, exactly, she intends to do when the conditions are right. Here is where the theory becomes genuinely speculative, because we have very little information about Maggie's interior life. She doesn't articulate it, by design. But we can make some inferences from her behavior. She is protective. This is consistent across her appearances. Maggie acts when people she cares about are threatened. She defends Homer, defends the family, defends innocent creatures from bullies in daycare. The protective instinct is one of her most reliable character traits, and it suggests that whatever she's building toward has something to do with care, with ensuring the safety and well-being of people she loves. She is strategic. She doesn't act impulsively, or rarely does. When she does act, it's after a period of observation and assessment. She checks that she's not being watched before she makes certain moves. She plans, and she has been watching Burns for a very long time. This is the thread that might tie it together. Maggie was in the room or near the room when Burns did numerous harmful things across dozens of episodes. She has seen the plant. She has seen the contamination. She understands, in ways that her family either doesn't see or has been made unable to see, the full picture of what Burns's operation has done to Springfield. What if Maggie's silence is not just a strategic choice about her own position, but a strategic choice about the right time to act on everything she knows? What if she's been building a case, assembling, over 30 years of observation, the complete picture of Burns's crimes, not just the environmental ones, not just the shooting, but the whole connected history of how one man's greed has shaped an entire town's reality? And what if she's waiting not for the right age, but for the right moment? For some change in circumstances, some crack in Burns's infrastructure of power, some alignment of conditions that would make action possible in a way it hasn't been before? This is obviously a fan theory built on the foundations of 35 years of close watching. It's not something the show has confirmed or will likely confirm, but it's a theory that gives Maggie's silence a different quality than simple absence. It makes the silence active. It makes every episode in which Maggie appears in the background not a comedic background element, but a document, another entry in the record of a witness who is taking everything in. If Maggie ever speaks, really speaks, not a cameo syllable, but a sustained, coherent act of communication, what she says will have been 30 years in the making. That's a long silence. But some things take that long to say correctly. Extended. Section 7. Mona Simpson. What the radical left behind. Mona Simpson left Springfield when Homer was approximately 6 years old. She was forced out. Burns identified her to the FBI after she and her fellow activists destroyed his biological weapons facility, and the subsequent threat of arrest made remaining with her family impossible. This is a clean enough story as origin stories go. Activist does something dangerous for good reasons, faces consequences, loses her family as a result. The tragedy is clear, the cause and effect is traceable, and the moral weight is assigned correctly. Burns's willingness to weaponize law enforcement against someone whose only crime was destroying weapons he shouldn't have had in the first place is one of the show's more pointed moments of political satire. But what hasn't been discussed as carefully is what Mona left behind in Homer. We talked briefly about the compass, the sense that Mona planted something in Homer in his first 6 years that has persisted, buried under decades of radiation exposure and cognitive compromise and self-suppression, into his adult life. But let's be more specific about what that something might be. Homer is, against all expectation and against his own evident self-interest, a person with a moral core. This core does not always operate reliably. It is suppressed by stupidity, by fear, by the overwhelming pressure of his social context, by the learned helplessness that comes from working for someone like Burns for decades. But it's there. It shows up in specific moments, under specific conditions, and when it shows up, it is unmistakable. Homer stands up for people who are being mistreated. Not always, not consistently, but in ways that suggest the impulse is real rather than performative. He is drawn to fairness in a way that his situation doesn't require, and his intelligence doesn't always support. He feels when something is wrong before he can articulate why, and he acts on that feeling with a kind of blunt moral force that occasionally produces the right outcome through sheer stubbornness. Where does this come from? The show has various answers across its run. The religious dimension, Homer's occasional conversations with God, which we haven't fully explored, suggests a spiritual component. The emotional dimension, Homer's deep love for his family, explains some of it as love-driven protectiveness. But Mona is, perhaps, the deepest answer. Mona was a person for whom the difference between right and wrong was so vivid and so urgent that she risked everything, her marriage, her freedom, her chance to raise her own child, to act on it. This is not a common disposition. Most people, even those with strong moral beliefs, accommodate themselves to the world as it is, rather than taking action against it when the cost is this high. Mona took the action. She paid the cost. And in the 6 years she had with Homer before she had to leave, she was that person in front of him every day. He watched her be that person. He absorbed what it looked like when someone made choices based on something other than self-interest. He internalized, without being able to name it, the orientation of someone who lives from a moral center. Then she disappeared, and Homer grew up in her absence, losing access to that orientation bit by bit through the radiation, through the psychological damage of maternal abandonment, through the specific demands of life in Springfield as a person without resources or protection. But the thing she planted didn't entirely die. It went underground, the way Mona went underground. It became invisible. covered over by all the accumulated damage and habit and compromise of adult life. But it's there. When Homer does the right thing, when he saves someone, when he stands up for something that costs him, when he is inexplicably generous or inexplicably brave, that's Mona. She left when he was 6. He's carried her since then. This is, in a quiet way, one of the show's most beautiful observations about how people shape each other. The influence that Mona had on Homer was brief and incomplete and then cut off entirely. She didn't get to finish the job. She didn't get to see what he became. And yet what she gave him in those early years proved durable enough to persist through everything Springfield did to him afterward. You can't predict which years will matter. You can't know, while you're in it, which moments are forming something permanent and which ones will pass without leaving a mark. Mona's years with Homer were interrupted before she could complete them. But they were real, and what was real left traces. Homer carries his mother in him unknowingly every time he does something that surprises you. Every time he's better than you expected. Every time the fog of his ordinary life parts briefly and something clearer comes through. That's her, even now, even after all this time. Extended Section 8. The predictions, the cultural feedback loop in detail. We discussed the predictions earlier, and we touched on the cultural feedback loop theory. The idea that The Simpsons didn't predict the future so much as it helped shape the future by normalizing certain ideas and possibilities in the cultural imagination. But this theory deserves more careful development because it's more interesting than it might initially appear. Start with a specific example. The episode in which Homer eats extremely spicy food is not, on the surface, a prediction of anything. It's a joke about Homer's appetite. But the episode also features a dream sequence involving a setting so visually distinctive and emotionally resonant that it has been referenced, parodied, and returned to repeatedly across cultural history. The visual language of that dream sequence, the colors, the geometry, the specific dreamlike quality of it has become part of the shared visual vocabulary of American popular culture in a way that's difficult to track precisely, but impossible to deny. The show shaped what a certain kind of dream looks like in the cultural imagination, not by predicting dreams, but by depicting them so memorably and so often that the depiction became the reference point. Now, scale this up. Apply it to something with more social and political weight. The show has depicted, repeatedly and in various forms, a kind of American political dysfunction that was satirical when depicted, but has increasingly come to seem like description. Corrupt local officials, regulatory capture, the influence of money on political process. The gap between what institutions say they do and what they actually do. The show has been illustrating these dynamics since the late 1980s for an enormous and multi-generational audience. What has 35 years of watching these dynamics illustrated actually done to the way Americans understand their political institutions? Not in the sense of making them more cynical, though, perhaps that too, but in the sense of shaping what dynamics they notice, what they expect to see, what pattern matching their minds do when they encounter political behavior. If you grew up watching The Simpsons, you have a vocabulary for certain kinds of political dysfunction. You have images and frameworks, and shorthand Mayor Quimby is shorthand for a certain kind of local politician, for instance, in a way that doesn't require anyone to have actually followed local Springfield politics closely. The character type has been absorbed. The category is available. And when a real politician exhibits the behaviors that the category contains, the self-dealing, the bluster, the fundamental unseriousness, you have a way of registering it that people who didn't grow up with The Simpsons might not have. You see it through a frame that the show provided. This is cultural influence operating at a level that's difficult to study rigorously because it's too diffuse and too embedded to trace causally. But it's real. The show has spent 35 years providing frames, ways of seeing, ways of categorizing, ways of understanding American life that have become part of how a significant portion of the population thinks. The predictions are real, in a specific sense. What the show predicted is not so much events as it is the frameworks through which those events would be understood. It didn't predict that a specific politician would do a specific thing. It predicted that there would be politicians like this, and it gave us the language for recognizing them. This is not prophecy. This is something more modest and more interesting. Sustained cultural work, done over a very long time, that ends up shaping the world it was describing. The most interesting predictions haven't happened yet. They're in the thousands of episodes, the thousands of situations the show has depicted that haven't yet found their real-world counterpart. Somewhere in that archive, there are frames being held in reserve, patterns waiting for the events that will complete them. Somewhere in Springfield, the future is already on screen. We just haven't caught up to it yet. Extended Section 9. Hans Moleman, the Cosmic Function. There's a way of reading Hans Moleman that we haven't tried yet, and it's perhaps the most interesting one. What if Moleman serves a function in Springfield's cosmology? Not just as a comedy element, not just as a running gag, but as something structurally necessary to how Springfield operates? This requires a slight detour into how certain kinds of narrative work. In many traditional story structures, there is a character whose role is to absorb the misfortune that would otherwise be distributed among the main characters. In folklore, this figure sometimes takes the form of a scapegoat, the one who carries the community's sins or misfortune, so that others can be relieved of them. In less overtly ritualistic narratives, the function might be filled by a tragedy character, someone whose losses and suffering are not randomized but are specifically concentrated so that the main characters can maintain their essentially comic relationship with the world. The Simpsons is, at its core, a comedy. Bad things happen to the main characters, but they don't accumulate in the way bad things accumulate for real people. Homer loses his job and gets it back. Homer's marriage is threatened and recovers. Homer causes catastrophes and is forgiven. The show can't sustain genuine tragedy in its main characters, because genuine tragedy would transform it from a comedy into something else. So where does the genuine tragedy go? Into Moleman. Moleman absorbs the real consequences. He's the character who actually dies when things go wrong, who experiences, on behalf of the show's universe, what it would actually mean for these disasters to have real costs. He takes the hit so Homer doesn't have to. This is not a random distribution of misfortune, it's a structural feature, and it explains why Moleman always comes back, because if he stayed dead, the function would need to be fulfilled by someone else, and someone else might be a main character. Moleman's survival is the survival of the show's fundamental genre. He exists to protect the comedy by containing the tragedy. This reading makes Moleman not a joke but a necessity, not a background gag but a load-bearing element. Remove Moleman, and Springfield's comedy becomes less stable. The misfortune that currently terminates safely in him would need somewhere else to go, and the place it would go would change the show. In this light, Moleman's persistence through death after death is not mysterious. It's the most logical thing about Springfield. Of course he comes back. The show needs him, not because the writers decided they like the character, though they clearly do, but because the narrative structure of Springfield requires someone in his role. He is, in a way, the most important character in the show. He's the one everyone ignores, and the one whose presence makes everything else possible. There's a loneliness to this too, if you let yourself feel it. To exist specifically to absorb what others can't carry. To be the one who takes the hit every time. To be necessary in a way that no one ever thanks you for, in a role that no one ever acknowledges. Moleman said he was 31 years old. He looks and sounds much older than that. Whatever has happened to him, whatever Springfield has done to him in the course of his service as the town's designated sufferer, it has aged him beyond his years, in ways that conventional biology doesn't fully explain. He looks, when you really look at him, like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He has. Extended Section 10. Ned Flanders, the Structure of Faith. We explored the sadness of Ned Flanders earlier tonight, the way his relentless positivity is a product of psychological modification rather than genuine spiritual achievement, the way his losses have accumulated without producing the growth that loss is supposed to generate in character arc terms, the way his faith is both his scaffold and his cage. But there's a dimension of Ned's story we haven't fully addressed, the theological dimension. Ned Flanders is the most overtly religious character in a show that has, over the years, had a surprisingly sophisticated relationship with questions of faith and transcendence. The show has depicted God, it has depicted the devil, it has depicted angels and heaven and hell and various other metaphysical furniture in ways that are usually comedic but occasionally have genuine weight. And Ned, as the show's designated faithful character, is positioned in a specific relationship with all of this. The relationship is not the one you'd expect. You'd expect a show with The Simpsons' general orientation skeptical, satirical, inclined to puncture pomposity, to treat Ned's faith as a target, to use his religiosity as the object of mockery, to suggest that his beliefs are naive or self-serving, or deserving of the cosmic punishments he receives. Instead, the show does something more interesting. It takes Ned's faith seriously enough to put it under genuine pressure. It creates situations that would genuinely challenge a person's belief in a caring God, situations where the faithful person's specific faith is not obviously rewarded. And it allows Ned to struggle with these situations without providing a clean resolution. Maud's death is the clearest example. Ned is, by any standard, a good man. He is also a grieving one, suddenly and unexpectedly deprived of his wife through a freak accident at a sporting event. In conventional religious narrative, this situation calls for a job-like exploration of why suffering happens to the faithful, a serious engagement with the problem of evil in the theological sense. The show doesn't quite do this. It treats Maud's death as a character beat rather than a genuine theological crisis. But what lingers, if you stay with the episode and its aftermath, is the specific quality of Ned's grief. The way it butts up against his faith without quite displacing it, the way he talks to God in his suffering in the particular way of someone whose relationship with God is tested, but not broken. Ned keeps praying. He keeps going to church. He keeps reading his Bible and doing his volunteer work and behaving, in all external ways, exactly as a man of genuine faith would behave. But the questions don't go away. The question of why Maud died, why the good are not protected from random misfortune, why his faith seems to provide him no advantage in a world that consistently fails to arrange itself according to righteous principles, these questions are always there, under the positivity, under the diddly-doodly manner. Ned manages them the way people have always managed these questions, with practice. Not by resolving them, but by building a life in which the questions can be held without destroying everything else. By surrounding himself with community, with purpose, with the specific comfort of ritual, by finding, in the activities of faith, the church attendance, the prayer, the charitable acts, not answers to the hard questions, but something like peace with the fact that the hard questions don't have answers. This is, whatever else it is, a very honest depiction of how faith actually operates for many people, not as a source of certainty or of divine protection, but as a practice, a set of habits and commitments that provide structure for a life in which certainty and protection are not available. Ned's faith is real. It's also not magic. It doesn't make his life easier, doesn't shield him from loss, doesn't provide him supernatural assistance in the difficult moments. What it provides is a framework for continuing, a way of making meaning out of experiences that resist meaning, a community of people who share the framework. Is this enough? The show doesn't quite say, but it treats the question with more respect than you might expect from a satire built on irreverence. And maybe this is Ned's most important contribution to Springfield's story. Not the comedy of his excessive goodness, not the sadness of his unrecognized worth, but the specific example he provides of someone who keeps going under conditions that would justify stopping, who finds in practice what he can't find in answers, who does the next right thing not because he's been guaranteed it will matter, but because doing the next right thing is, in the end, all that faith actually asks. Extended Section 11. Sideshow Bob, the tragedy of wasted potential. We discussed the surface of Sideshow Bob's story, the obsession, the rake, the recurring failure, but there's a deeper tragedy here that the show has been assembling for decades without quite naming it directly. Sideshow Bob is brilliant. Not moderately intelligent, not cleverly written, genuinely, unusually, remarkably intelligent. He speaks multiple languages fluently. He has genuine aesthetic sophistication. His reactions to great art and music and literature are not performances. They're the responses of someone who actually cares. He has the capacity for long-term strategic thinking that operates across years and even decades. He builds systems, constructs elaborate frameworks, sustains complex plans through significant adversity. And he's spent his entire adult life trying to kill a 10-year-old boy. The tragedy here isn't just that his efforts have been misdirected. The tragedy is what Bob could have been, and what he gave up in choosing what he became. Consider what someone with Bob's capabilities could accomplish if properly channeled. The strategic intelligence that goes into plotting Bart's demise could go into almost anything else: scientific research, political strategy, artistic production, the construction of businesses or institutions or social movements. The linguistic ability that lets him deliver eloquent speeches about his crimes could go into poetry, into diplomacy, into teaching. The patience and persistence that sustain a decades-long vendetta could sustain almost any long-term goal. Bob knows this. He's smart enough to know what he's giving up. And this is what makes the choice most interesting, because it is clearly a choice. Not an unconscious compulsion, but a decision, revisited and recommitted to with each escape from prison and each new scheme. Why does he keep choosing it? One answer is that the obsession with Bart has become, over time, the structure that holds Bob's identity together. We talked about this briefly earlier, but it deserves more attention. Bob was, before the Bart situation, a deeply frustrated man, talented, proud, aware of his capabilities, and stuck in a professional role sidekick to a clown that was profoundly beneath him. He was, in the most basic sense, not getting to be who he knew he was. The Bart revenge narrative gave him something that Krusty's sidekick never could: stakes. The sense that what he was doing mattered, that the outcome had genuine weight, that his actions had real consequences. He is more himself in prison, planning Bart's murder, than he ever was in the role that preceded the crime. This is, psychologically, a recognizable dynamic. People sometimes need an enemy to feel real, need a goal, even a destructive one, to feel purposeful. The obsession gives Bob a story, a narrative in which he has a role, a motivation, a trajectory. Without the obsession, he might have to confront the question of what story he actually wants to be living. And that question is harder than it sounds, for someone who has been who Bob is for as long as he's been it. The rakes in this reading are not just a running gag. They're the physical manifestation of the universe's attempt to interrupt the obsession, to force a pause, to make Bob stop for a moment and feel the slapstick absurdity of what he's doing. Each rake is an invitation to notice how ridiculous this has become. He keeps not noticing, but the show has, in recent seasons, shown us glimpses of a Bob who does notice, who is aware, at some level, of the waste, who has experienced enough: the wife, the son, the moments of genuine connection that exist alongside the vendetta, to know that the obsession is not the whole of who he could be. He just can't stop. Not yet. Not without something changing in him that hasn't changed yet. What would that change look like? The show has never quite shown us. Maybe it can't, within the constraints of Bob's role in Springfield's story. Maybe it requires Bob to step entirely out of the story that Springfield has assigned him, but the potential for it is there. It's been there since the beginning. Wasted potential is one of Springfield's recurring themes. Homer's wasted potential, Bart's wasted potential, Burns's potential wasted on accumulation, Ned's potential wasted on suppression, and Bob's potential wasted on Bart. The show loves its characters too much to let them transform completely, but it loves them enough to show you what could have been. What was in them, always, that the circumstances of their lives and choices in town never quite allowed to fully develop. Springfield is full of people who could have been something else. Maybe that's what makes it feel so much like home. Extended Section 12. Springfield, the town that reflects us back. For our final extended exploration, I want to go back to something we touched on in several earlier sections and spend some real time with it. The idea that Springfield doesn't just depict America. It reflects America back at itself. This is a subtler claim than it might first appear, and it's worth developing carefully. When a satirical work depicts its subject, the relationship is relatively one-directional. The satirist observes the world, finds what's ridiculous or unjust or hypocritical, and depicts it in a way that makes the ridiculousness visible. The audience looks at the depiction and says, "Yes, that's true. That's how things are. I hadn't quite seen it that way, but you're right." This is what The Simpsons does in its more directly satirical moments. Burns as corporate villain, Mayor Quimby as corrupt local politician, Krusty as the commodified face of children's entertainment. These are satirical portraits, and they work the way satire works. They take something real and exaggerate it until the shape of it is undeniable. But something else has happened over 35 years. Something that goes beyond satire into something more like mutual influence. The show has become so embedded in American culture, so thoroughly woven into the shared imaginative life of the last several generations that it's no longer just depicting America. It has become part of what America uses to depict itself. The references circulate in ways that have nothing to do with watching the show. People who have seen very few episodes know Homer Simpson, know the meme of Homer retreating into bushes, know the "well, duh" meme, know the image of Homer choking Bart. These images have entered the cultural bloodstream and are now part of how Americans communicate certain emotional and social realities to each other. This means that when the show depicts something, it's not just describing it. It's contributing to the way that thing gets understood, remembered, and transmitted. The show's representation of nuclear power plants, of corrupt local government, of working-class economic anxiety, of American family dynamics, these representations have become part of the vocabulary through which the things themselves are understood. And here's where it gets interesting. If the representation shapes the understanding, and the understanding shapes the behavior, then the representation has, in some indirect way, shaped the behavior. The cultural work the show has been doing for 35 years has not been passive documentation. It has been active participation in the ongoing process of America deciding what it is. This is a heavy thing to lay at the feet of a cartoon about a family in a made-up town. But the weight of influence doesn't really depend on the carrier's size. The Simpsons has reached more Americans, and reached them at more formative moments in their lives, than almost any other piece of media in the last 4 decades. It has reached people before they had strong opinions about politics or economics or family structure or institutional trust, and it has given them a set of images and frameworks that they've carried into their adult lives as background assumptions. The three-eyed fish is not just a joke about nuclear power. It's an image that has been sitting in the back of millions of minds for 30 years, available for activation when the subject of nuclear contamination comes up. The image primes the response. People who haven't thought consciously about the three-eyed fish in years will find it surfacing when they encounter a news story about industrial pollution. This is cultural influence at its most basic level, and it scales up from the individual gag to the show's overall worldview. A generation raised on The Simpsons has had its understanding of authority, of institutions, of the relationship between ordinary people and the structures that govern their lives, shaped, not determined, but shaped by what the show consistently said about these things. What did it say? It said, the authorities are probably not handling things well. It said, the institutions are probably being run in the interests of the powerful rather than the general population. It said, the people at the top probably know more than they're telling you, and what they know probably isn't good. It said these things through comedy, through satire, through a mode that makes them easier to absorb than a direct argument would be. And then it sent millions of people out into the world carrying these frameworks. The America that grew up with The Simpsons is, in some ways, the America that The Simpsons predicted. Not because the show was prophetic, but because the show participated in making it and building the cultural context in which certain things became normal to expect, certain dynamics became recognizable, certain forms of dysfunction became the assumed shape of institutions rather than the exception. This is neither blame nor credit. It's just the way influence works, especially long-running influence. You can't spend 35 years shaping how a culture imagines itself without having some effect on what the culture becomes. Springfield is America, but it's also one of the tools America used to become itself. The mirror and the thing it reflects have been facing each other long enough to start blurring together. And now we sit here, watching a family in a house, in a town that might be anywhere, that has always been everywhere, that is in some sense constructed from our own reflection, and we feel something like recognition, and something like nostalgia, and something like the particular comfort of coming home to a place that has always known you. Because that's what it has always been doing, knowing us. Coda. The enduring mystery. Every mystery we've explored tonight has an official answer. The floating timeline exists because of format constraints. Burns survives because the show keeps him alive. Maggie shot Burns accidentally. Molman dies because the show needs a comedy death character. The predictions are coincidence and confirmation bias. These answers are real, they're not wrong, but they're also not quite satisfying, are they? They explain the mechanics without explaining the feeling. They account for the production decisions without accounting for why those decisions consistently produce something that feels heavier than comedy, more resonant than entertainment, more true than fiction. The unofficial answers, the theories, the fan frameworks, the ways of reading Springfield that aren't endorsed by the show's creators are reaching for something the official answers don't provide. They're reaching for meaning, for the sense that the patterns and the accumulations and the 35 years of consistent obsession with this one family in this one impossible town are pointing at something. Maybe they are. Maybe the meaning is there, even if the mechanism is mundane. Maybe a show can accidentally accumulate profundity through sheer persistence. Maybe 35 years of depicting human beings, even cartoon human beings, even exaggerated and simplified and deliberately unrealistic human beings in the specific difficulties of domestic life, produces something that speaks to what it's like to be alive in a family, in a community, in a culture, in a time. Homer is us. Not in the obvious, meme-worthy sense of Homer as lazy everyman, but in the specific sense of a person who loves more than he can say, and fails more than he means to, and comes back, every time, to the place and the people that matter most. Who gets it wrong repeatedly and keeps trying anyway? Who is funnier than he means to be and sadder than anyone acknowledges, and more there than the casual observer might notice? Springfield is our town, not because it looks like where we live, but because it feels like where we live. The gap between the official version of events and what's actually happening, the institutions that aren't quite functioning, the people in authority who aren't quite trustworthy, the gap between who we mean to be and who we actually are, the love that doesn't quite say itself correctly but is real nonetheless. Maggie is the part of us that watches and doesn't speak. Lisa is the part of us that knows better and can't quite make that knowing useful. Bart is the part of us that would rather be anywhere but here and always comes back anyway. Marge is the part of us that holds things together past the point where holding makes rational sense. And Homer. Homer is the part of us that is deeply, irrevocably human, flawed past the point where the flaws should be forgivable, and somehow forgiven anyway. Reaching for donuts and love and simple pleasures and occasionally, unexpectedly, for something higher. Every episode is a mystery. Not in the genre fiction sense, but in the oldest sense of the word. Something you encounter again and again, something you return to, something that means something different each time because you've changed, not it. Springfield doesn't change. We do. And that's the deepest mystery of all. Why we keep returning to a place that stays the same while we move through the time it refuses to acknowledge. Why we sit with these stories about people who will never grow up while we grow older ourselves. Why we watch the same family make the same mistakes and feel, each time, something like comfort. Maybe because they remind us what we're doing here, what we're trying to do, in our own imperfect, frequently failing, often funny, occasionally beautiful way. We're trying to get home. And Springfield is always there when we arrive. Good night, and bonus deep dives, mysteries we haven't fully explored. The mystery of Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon. There is a character who ran the Quick E-Mart for the first 20-something seasons of the show, and whose story, when you trace it carefully, is one of the more quietly fascinating in Springfield's history. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilan has a doctorate, not an honorary one, not an informal credential, an actual PhD in computer science from the Calcutta Institute of Technology, earned legitimately. He came to America to pursue further education, obtained another degree, and then remained, for reasons that the show explains in pieces. He fell in love with America, he got complicated, he stayed, and then he spent his professional life selling convenience store products at a markup to the people of Springfield, working hours that would be illegal in most developed countries, for a corporate owner, the Quick E-Mart chain, who is depicted as exploitative in specific and detailed ways. Why is someone with a doctorate in computer science running a convenience store? The show has several answers, none of which are quite satisfying on their own. The immigration complications of staying in America legally required certain accommodations. The Quick E-Mart provided something like stability when other options weren't available. The community of Springfield, whatever its problems, became home in ways that made the calculation of leaving complicated. These are all real factors. They're also, if you read them together, a portrait of how credential and capability and ambition can be systematically redirected by circumstance into something much smaller than what was intended. Apu is one of the smartest people in Springfield, and he has spent decades in a job that doesn't require or reward his intelligence. This is not a unique story. It is, in fact, a very common story among immigrants to America: the doctor who becomes a cab driver, the engineer who becomes a shop owner, the academic who becomes whatever work is available while other doors remain closed. The reasons are various and structural and deeply embedded in the systems that regulate belonging and access and credential recognition. The show depicts this without quite naming it as the thing it is. Apu's situation is played for comedy: the long hours, the dedicated service, the relationship with the Quickie Mart as an institution, and the comedy often lands. But underneath the comedy is something that looks, if you look at it long enough, like waste. Not Apu's fault, not entirely Springfield's fault, but the waste that results from systems that don't make good use of the people inside them. Apu's marriage adds another layer. He and Manjula have octuplets, a plot development that was, by any storytelling measure, enormous. And the show's relationship with what that means for the family is characteristically inconsistent. The octuplets appear and disappear as needed. The practical implications of raising 8 children while working the hours Apu works are not consistently reckoned with. But in the moments when the show does reckon with it, there's a weight to Apu's life that the comedy doesn't entirely cover. He loves his family, he loves his store, he loves, in his way, Springfield, the specific community of which he has become an irreducible part. But the life he's living is not the life he planned, and the gap between those two things is the mystery the show has never quite resolved. What would Apu have been if the circumstances had arranged themselves differently? If the immigration system had been more accommodating, if the economic circumstances had provided more space, if Springfield had been a different kind of town with different kinds of opportunities? The show doesn't ask the question directly, but the answer is visible in Apu's eyes sometimes, in the specific quality of attention he brings to his work, the way he solves problems that don't require a PhD to solve, the efficiency and precision of a mind that is operating significantly below its ceiling. He is, in this reading, another of Springfield's quietly tragic figures. Not tragic in the dramatic sense; his life has genuine joy in it, genuine love, genuine community. But tragic in the specific sense of the word that means capable of more than the circumstances allowed. The mystery of Chief Wiggum and the failure of justice. Chief Clancy Wiggum is, by every available metric, one of the most comprehensively unqualified law enforcement officers in the history of American fiction. He is easily bribed. He is easily deceived. He prioritizes donuts and personal comfort over virtually every professional obligation. He investigates crimes in ways that manage to be both incompetent and coincidentally accurate, as if the truth occasionally finds him despite his best efforts to miss it. His department is understaffed, under-resourced, and characterized throughout the show's run by a fundamental orientation towards self-preservation rather than public service. And Springfield has no alternative to him. He is the law. His department is the law. The entire formal apparatus of criminal justice in Springfield runs through Clancy Wiggum, and Clancy Wiggum runs through donuts and naps and the occasional flash of intuition that is always attributed to skill rather than luck. What does it mean for a community to have law enforcement of this quality as its only option? The show has explored this from multiple angles, and the answer is consistently, it means the community is largely self-governing, for better and worse. In the absence of reliable law enforcement, Springfield's residents have developed informal systems of conflict resolution, social sanction, and mutual accountability that operate outside Wiggum's jurisdiction and knowledge. The mob episodes in which the Springfield residents form collective vigilante groups to address some grievance or threat are usually played for comedy, but they depict something real. Communities whose official structures are inadequate develop unofficial ones. The unofficial structures are often cruder and sometimes more unjust than the official ones they're replacing, but they're responsive in ways the official structures aren't. But there's a more interesting dimension to Wiggum's failure than simply the comedy of incompetent authority, because Wiggum's incompetence is not random. It has a shape. It consistently fails upward in the sense that small crimes by ordinary people get addressed, sometimes ineffectively, but addressed while large crimes by powerful people are consistently missed, ignored, or actively overlooked. Burns gets away with environmental crimes repeatedly. Springfield's various corrupt politicians get away with their corruption. The structural harms, the ones that emerge from wealth and power, rather than from individual criminal behavior, are essentially invisible to Wiggum's justice. This isn't accidental. The show is making a point about the relationship between law enforcement and power that doesn't require making Wiggum explicitly corrupt, only systematically limited. He can see what's in front of him. He can't see what's been made invisible to him by the architecture of the system he works within. He arrests the people the system has made visible to him as criminals. He misses the people the system has made invisible as criminals. And the pattern of visibility and invisibility maps very cleanly onto the pattern of power and powerlessness in Springfield. This is the mystery of Chief Wiggum. He is not the worst-case scenario for law enforcement. He's not actively malicious, not fundamentally corrupt in the way that some corrupt officials are. He's just shaped by his context, responding to the incentives and the information and the pressures that his specific position in Springfield's social order provides. And in responding to those things, he produces outcomes that consistently protect the powerful and expose the vulnerable, not through design, but through the natural operation of a system that was built to produce exactly those outcomes. Springfield doesn't have justice. It has Wiggum, and Wiggum has the system has Burns, and the circle holds. The mystery of Krusty, the clown, the entertainer, as tragedy? Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky, known to the world as Krusty the Clown, is one of the most fully realized characters in The Simpsons' enormous cast, and one of the most consistently heartbreaking. He is a bad man in most of the ways that matter in everyday life. He smokes, he gambles, he has maintained a fraudulent business empire built on products that range from substandard to actively dangerous. His relationship with his audience, primarily children, is one of cynical extraction rather than genuine care. He does not like children, a fact the show reveals repeatedly and with some relish. He is doing a children's entertainer's job without any of the accompanying affection. And yet, there are moments in Krusty's story where something else shows up, where the cynicism falls away temporarily and you see the person underneath it, and the person underneath it is considerably more interesting than the cynical entertainer. The storyline involving Krusty's father, Rabbi Krustovsky, played by Jackie Mason, is probably the most emotionally ambitious the show has ever done with the character. It explores the specific pain of a father's disapproval, the specific wound that comes from having your choices rejected by the person whose opinion matters most, and the way that wound can drive a person's entire career not toward healing but away from the source of pain. Krusty became a clown in defiance of his father, who wanted him to continue the family's rabbinical tradition. This is, on its face, a classic story of generational conflict. Child rejects parents' expectations, pursues own path, succeeds on their own terms. But the Krusty version of the story is complicated by the fact that Krusty's path, the one he chose in defiance, has not made him happy. He has succeeded in the most measurable ways: fame, wealth, influence over the Saturday morning cultural landscape of multiple generations, and he is one of the most miserable characters in Springfield. The defiance didn't liberate him. It just gave him a different set of chains. And the father's disapproval, sustained for decades, has become a weight that Krusty carries in every performance, every joke, every cynical product endorsement. He is, in some sense, always performing for his father, either trying to impress him, or trying to hurt him, or trying to prove something that the father's silence makes it impossible to prove. When the reconciliation eventually comes, when Rabbi Krustovsky comes to accept his son's choices, when the wound is acknowledged and the relationship repaired, Krusty's relief is one of the show's most genuinely tender moments. You see the exhaustion in him. You see what it cost him to carry the rupture for so long. You see how much of his cynicism was a defense against the pain of it. But here's what's mysterious about Krusty. The reconciliation doesn't transform him. He remains, in subsequent episodes, essentially the same Krusty. The gambling, the smoking, the compromised relationship with his own professional integrity. The father's approval, when it finally came, didn't solve the problem because the problem was never really about his father's approval. The problem was about what Krusty's choices said about him, and no amount of parental reconciliation can resolve that. Krusty is, in the deepest reading, a man who made a choice for the wrong reasons and has been living with that choice for decades. Not that being an entertainer is wrong, clearly. It can be noble, valuable, meaningful work. But Krusty got into it for reasons of rebellion rather than vocation, and rebellion, once the relationship it's reacting against is resolved, leaves you holding a life that was never entirely yours. What would Krusty be If he had become an entertainer because he genuinely loved entertaining, would the cynicism lift? Would the fondness for his audience develop? Would the products be safer, the business more ethical, the man himself more at peace? The show never quite explores this counterfactual, because Krusty's cynicism is too useful as a comedic element. But the counterfactual hovers. The better version of Krusty is visible sometimes, in flashes, in moments when he forgets to be cynical and just performs, and something true comes through. In those moments, you can see why children love him. Not the product-endorsing, corner-cutting, child labor-exploiting Krusty. The Krusty who is actually funny when he's not trying to be. That Krusty exists. He just lives underground, beneath the persona that Rebellion built. The mystery of the supporting characters, Springfield's hidden depths. One of the things that makes Springfield genuinely different from other fictional small towns is the density of its supporting cast. Most fictional small towns have a handful of recurring characters who occupy specific social functions: the friendly shopkeeper, the eccentric neighbor, the local authority figure. Springfield has dozens of fully realized supporting characters, each with their own arc, their own contradictions, their own specific relationship to the show's larger themes. Dr. Nick Riviera is, on the surface, a joke about incompetent medicine. The doctor, whose qualifications are clearly fraudulent, whose procedures are clearly dangerous, whose professional standing is clearly the product of some regulatory failure, we're better off not examining too closely. "Hi, everybody," is a catchphrase built on the comedy of a man who is absolutely not who he claims to be, operating in a context that requires exactly who he claims to be. But Dr. Nick has been practicing medicine in Springfield for 35 years. He has survived malpractice suits, medical board investigations, and the kind of patient outcomes that would end most medical careers in their first decade. He persists, and the people of Springfield keep going to him. Why? Because he's affordable, because he's available, because the alternative, the legitimate medical system, with its waiting times and insurance requirements and complicated financial arrangements, is inaccessible in ways that Dr. Nick, whatever his qualifications, is not. This is not just a joke about incompetent doctors. It's a joke about healthcare access. Dr. Nick exists in Springfield because there's a gap in the healthcare market that legitimate medicine doesn't serve, and he fills that gap. The fact that he fills it dangerously is the dark edge of what's otherwise a comedy premise. Professor Frink is Springfield's resident scientist, brilliant, bumbling, operating at a level of technical sophistication that neither Springfield nor its residents can quite accommodate. He is the scientist as outsider. His knowledge is respected in theory and ignored in practice. When Springfield needs a scientific-sounding explanation for something, Frink is available. When Springfield's actual decision-making is happening, the scientific perspective is rarely central. This, too, is a joke about something real. The relationship between expertise and democratic decision-making, the specific problem of how a community integrates scientific knowledge into its governance when scientific knowledge is both highly specialized and politically inconvenient. Frink knows things that would be useful to Springfield. Springfield doesn't use them, because using them would complicate the stories Springfield prefers to tell itself. Comic Book Guy is perhaps the most self-aware of Springfield's supporting characters, self-aware in the specific sense of being a character who knows he's a type, who references his own typeness, who has made the performance of his type into his personality. He is the fan, the person whose relationship to media has become so central to his identity that other forms of relating to the world have atrophied. He judges, he compares. He maintains a vast archive of specific knowledge about things that don't directly affect his daily life, and he deploys this knowledge as currency in social interactions. The show uses Comic Book Guy to comment on fandom, including, occasionally, its own fandom. He is, in some readings, a mirror held up to the more obsessive corners of Simpsons viewership, the people who track continuity errors across decades, who argue about which season marked the show's decline, who engage with Springfield as if its internal logic were as important as actual reality. This is either very mean or very generous of the show, depending on how you look at it. It's mean because it's recognizing the obsessiveness as somewhat ridiculous. It's generous because the obsessiveness is treated as a coherent identity rather than simply a pathology. Comic Book Guy may be a joke, but he's a joke with depth, someone for whom what he loves genuinely matters. in a world that doesn't always make space for that kind of caring. All of these characters and dozens more, Springfield's supporting cast running into the hundreds across 35 years, are mysteries in miniature. Each of them is a complete human story compressed into the space available to a recurring background character. Each of them has a life that the show has implied more than it has shown, a history that goes beyond the episodes in which they appear, a set of questions that were never fully answered. Springfield's depth is in this density. The sense you get, watching the show carefully, that every background face is a full person with problems and histories and inner lives that the show has room for, only in glimpses, is part of what makes Springfield feel like a place rather than a set. Real places work this way. You live somewhere for years and you see the same faces, know them by their appearances and their patterns, understand them only partially. Everyone around you is a mystery you'll never have time to fully solve. Springfield captures this. It gives you hundreds of people you'll never quite know, and in doing so, it makes a fictional town feel, against all odds, like the real thing. The mystery of the Treehouse of Horror, what Springfield fears. Every October for 35 years, the Simpsons family has gathered to tell horror stories. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show's annual departure from its established rules episodes in which the characters can die, in which the laws of the show's universe can be suspended, in which dark material can be explored more directly than the regular format allows. They are, in many ways, the show at its most unguarded. Freed from the obligations of continuity and consequence, the writers can go anywhere, do anything. Let their imagination move in directions the regular show keeps closed. What directions do they go? Horror. Classic horror. Specifically, Poe, Kafka, old monster movies, science fiction dystopias, psychological terror, the particular dread of the uncanny of familiar things made wrong. The Treehouse episodes are a consistent love letter to a specific tradition of imaginative fear. But look at the fears being explored across these episodes, and something interesting emerges. The horror the show consistently returns to is not random. It has shapes, it has patterns, it has specific anxieties that recur across decades. One fear is loss of control. Homer controlled by an alien force, Springfield controlled by a supernatural entity, the family controlled by forces they can't see or resist. The Treehouse episodes are full of characters who find their will, their agency, their ability to make meaningful choices, stripped from them by something outside their understanding. This is, when you notice it, a very specific anxiety, the anxiety of a person who lives in a world where the forces shaping his life are largely invisible and largely outside his control. Another fear is transformation. Characters who become monsters, who discover they contain something inhuman, who find that the person they thought they were is not quite accurate. Homer as a monster who doesn't know he's a monster. Bart with abilities that make him dangerous. The familiar made strange from the inside. And then there is the fear of the past. Ghost stories, time travel stories, stories in which the choices of the past return to claim the present. Springfield has a past, the ecological damage of the power plant, the manipulation of Homer's family by Burns, the various harms done and not adequately reckoned with, and the Treehouse episodes, in their more thoughtful moments, seem to be processing that past, imagining what it would look like if Springfield's buried history actually came back, if the things avoided and forgotten actually demanded to be faced. This is what horror does at its best. It dramatizes the fears that we can't address directly. It gives them a form, a monster, a ghost, a dystopian future that allows us to look at them without being destroyed by the looking. Springfield's horror is not random. It is the specific fear of a specific community, of not being in control, of being something you didn't choose, of the past catching up, of the systems you depend on being turned against you. These are not abstract fears. They are the fears that follow logically from living in Springfield, from knowing, at some level, about the plant and the water and the billionaire who remembers things no one else remembers. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are, in this reading, Springfield's unconscious speaking. Saying the things the regular episodes can't say, giving form to the anxieties that daily life in a floating timeline comedy town requires to be kept at bay. The monsters in Springfield are funny, but the fears they represent are real. And October, year after year, Springfield faces them. In the safety of a story, with the lights on and the family together, it looks directly at the things it's afraid of. Then November comes, and it forgets until next year, which is perhaps the most Springfield thing of all, the mystery of Springfield's economy. How does this town function? Springfield has a complex, sometimes internally contradictory economy that rewards analysis. The power plant is the anchor. Burns's enterprise provides electricity to every resident, employs a significant workforce, and through the various secondary economic effects of that employment, the spending at local businesses, the housing demand, the associated service industries underpins a substantial portion of Springfield's economic activity. Beyond the plant, Springfield has a surprising diversity of small businesses. Moe's Tavern, the Quick E-Mart, Krusty Burger, the Android's Dungeon, Comic Book Guy's Store, Springfield Elementary, which is a public institution but a significant employer. The Springfield Power Plant itself is the largest single employer but not the only one. And Springfield has industries that come and go. This is one of the show's more interesting and less noted ongoing elements. In various episodes, Springfield has had a monorail system, a movie studio, a pro football team, a casino, a burlesque house, a major convention center, and dozens of other businesses that appear for an episode and then vanish. The town's economy is, in this sense, perpetually in flux, new industries arriving, old ones failing, the economic landscape constantly reshaping itself. What remains constant is the plant. And what's interesting about the plant's constancy is what it says about the relationship between Springfield's economy and Mr. Burns. Burns doesn't just control the electricity. He controls, through the employment and the purchasing power that the plant generates, a significant portion of Springfield's economic vitality. When the plant does well, Springfield does well. When the plant struggles, as it sometimes does, in episodes involving regulatory crackdowns or competition or Burns's various misadventures, Springfield struggles. This creates a structural alignment of interests between Springfield's residents and the plant's owner that makes opposition to Burns economically irrational for most people. To oppose Burns is to potentially destabilize the economic engine that the whole town depends on. Even people who understand that Burns is harmful, even people who have direct evidence of the plant's environmental damage, face a calculation in which the economic cost of addressing the harm seems larger than the harm itself. This is not a calculation unique to Springfield. It's a calculation that real communities face in real relationships with real industrial employers. The language of economic dependence, we can't afford to push too hard, we need those jobs, is familiar from countless real-world stories about communities and the corporations that shape their economies. The show renders this dynamic clearly, and, in its most pointed moments, critically. But it also renders it sympathetically. The people making this calculation are not villains. They're people trying to pay their mortgages. They're people whose children depend on the economic stability that the plant provides. They're people who can see the harm, but who can also see, very clearly, that they can't afford to address it. This is the tragedy of Springfield's economy. It is not designed to produce the conditions in which its own most significant problems can be addressed. The plant causes harm. Addressing the harm would threaten the plant. The plant's survival is necessary for the town's economic health. Therefore, the harm continues. The loop is closed. And the only way out of a closed loop is to introduce something from outside it, a force or a factor that wasn't part of the original system and can break its equilibrium. Springfield has never found that force. Or, if it has, the force has never been sustained long enough to actually change anything. The economy hums, the plant runs, Burns survives, Springfield continues, and somewhere in Sector 7G, Homer Simpson sleeps at his desk, and the loop turns over again. The mystery of the opening sequence, everything the show tells you in the first 2 minutes. There's a reading of The Simpsons that suggests everything you need to know about the show is in the opening sequence. Not the specific plot elements the opening changes, famously, with every episode's couch gag, but the structure, the arc, the way the opening is built. It begins with a fanfare. Springfield appears from the clouds you're descending, or the town is being revealed and the camera sweeps through the town in a continuous movement that manages to establish most of its geography and population in about 90 seconds. The camera doesn't linger. It moves through Springfield the way you move through a familiar place, quickly, confidently, hitting the important stops without needing to slow down for explanation. This is the show telling you, right from the beginning that you already know where you are. Springfield doesn't need introduction. It's already home. The sequence traces each family member separately, then brings them together at the couch. This is the show's thesis in miniature. 5 people with 5 separate lives who end up in the same place. Homer at the plant, Marge at the store, Bart at school, Lisa at school. Maggie is the interesting one in the opening, because Maggie's sequence always involves some variation on her being in more control of a situation than anyone expects, then the control being taken away or lost, then Maggie arriving at the couch anyway. Maggie's arc in the opening sequence is agency, obstacle, arrival. She gets there despite everything. This is, in miniature, Maggie's arc in the show itself. The couch gag is where the opening becomes unlimited. It is the show's recurring acknowledgement of its own genre. Animation can do anything, and once a season the show uses that possibility fully, stretching and breaking and reimagining the premise of the opening to show that what looks like formula contains infinite variation. The most celebrated couch gags are the ones that break the fourth wall most completely, the ones in which the Simpsons, or their couch, or their living room, become aware that they're part of a show. These gags tend to generate the most discussion, because they raise explicitly the question that the rest of the show raises implicitly. What's it like to be a character in a story? What's the relationship between the character and the show? What does it mean to exist in fiction? These are questions the show has been asking for 35 years without quite giving an answer. The couch gag is where the questions become explicit, where the show steps out from behind its own format and winks at you directly. But even the most ordinary couch gag, the one that's just a quick, visual joke about the family finding their seats, carries the essential message of the opening. We're here. We made it. Whatever happened out there, we're together now. That's what the opening always resolves to. Chaos to order, separation to reunion, the individual trajectory folding back into the collective. 5 people who were each living their own story, converging on a couch. This is the emotional truth the show has been telling for 35 years, in 2 minutes, every week. Everything else is elaboration. The mystery of the Simpsons' marriage, why they stay together. Homer and Marge's marriage is one of the most analyzed relationships in American popular culture, and the analysis tends to focus on the puzzle of it. Why does Marge stay? Why does she endure Homer's failures, his absences, his spectacular and recurring incompetence as a partner? Why does a woman of her evident intelligence and capability remain in a relationship that, on paper, offers her significantly less than she appears to deserve? The standard answers are various. She loves him genuinely, inexplicably, in the specific way that love sometimes attaches itself to people who don't quite seem to warrant it from the outside. She's committed to the marriage, to the family, to a set of values that prioritize permanence over optimization. She has made a choice and she honors it, because honoring choices is part of who she is. These are real answers. But there's something they don't quite get at, which is the question underneath the question. What is it, specifically, that Marge gets from Homer that she couldn't get elsewhere? The show has approached this from different angles at different points in its run. There are episodes that attempt to articulate what Marge sees in Homer, what he offers that more apparently suitable partners couldn't. The answers tend to involve specific qualities that Homer has despite everything. His capacity for joy, which is ungoverned and unlimited. His fundamental warmth, which expresses itself badly but is real. His specific kind of devotion, which is not consistent or articulate but is total. Homer loves Marge completely and incompetently. He is not a good husband by any measurable standard. But the love itself, the wanting, the caring, the specific orientation of his attention toward her, even when he's managing it poorly, is real and evident in ways that she can feel. And Marge loves Homer in a way that is partly about who he is and partly about who she is. She is a person who needs to be needed, who finds meaning in care, who has, whether she would choose this or not, built her identity substantially around the work of keeping a difficult thing together. This is not a pathology, it's a recognizable human orientation. But it means that the challenge Homer represents is not only a burden, it's also, in some sense, the thing that makes her most fully herself. This is complicated territory, and the show is honest enough to show the complications. There are episodes where Marge comes close to the edge, where the accumulation of Homer's failures, the weight of what she carries, the sense that she has compromised herself more than she should have, produces something like Crisis. She doesn't always step back from the edge easily. She doesn't always come back without cost. But she comes back. She makes the choice, again and again, to stay. And the making of the choice is itself part of the relationship. The fact that she can see what she might have and chooses this instead is a form of commitment that's more meaningful than simply never having the option. The mystery of the Simpson marriage is the mystery of any long marriage. How does love sustain itself against the erosion of ordinary disappointment and daily friction, and the slow accumulation of evidence about who a person really is? How do you keep choosing someone when you know them well enough to see clearly their limitations and their selfishness and their specific failures? The show's answer, implicit across 35 years of episodes, is you don't maintain it. You rebuild it, again and again. From the rubble of whatever episode just ended, you find the thing that made you choose this person in the first place, and you choose them again. It's not romantic in the movie poster sense. It's not grand gestures and sweeping declarations. It's the ordinary, demanding, frequently exhausting work of two people deciding repeatedly that the difficulty is worth it. Homer and Marge stay together because they keep deciding to. That's the mystery. That's also the answer. The mystery of Bart's potential. The tragedy of the underachiever. Bart Simpson is, in many ways, the show's most misunderstood character. He's marketed as a rebel, as a troublemaker, as a cartoon ID given full expression. He's the character who gave a generation of children the word cowabunga and the permission to express a certain kind of cheerful irreverence toward authority. He's the one whose face was on t-shirts and his slogan on bumper stickers. He became, for a period in the early 1990s, something like a cultural icon. And underneath all of this, quietly, the show has always suggested that Bart Simpson is something much more interesting than a cartoon rebel. He is a genuinely intelligent person who has been processed by systems that don't know what to do with his kind of intelligence. Bart's intelligence is not the kind that shows up on standardized tests or in organized academic environments. His IQ, when it's been tested in specific episodes, does not reflect the cognitive sophistication he demonstrates in other contexts. He is not a good student by the school's measures. He doesn't succeed in the structures that Springfield Elementary provides, but he is brilliant at things that those structures don't test. He is socially intelligent in ways that his sister, for all her formal genius, is not. He understands people, what they want, what they're afraid of, how to motivate them, how to manipulate them when he chooses to. He is creative and adaptive under pressure. He builds and sustains complex social alliances with remarkable skill. He understands his environment, Springfield's social landscape, with a depth that formal education never produced. What would happen if these capabilities were recognized, named, and cultivated? The show has explored this in specific episodes where a teacher or a mentor or an unusual circumstance creates the conditions for Bart to operate at his full capacity. In these episodes, what emerges is not just competence but something close to excellence. Bart, given the right context, can do extraordinary things, but the right context almost never persists. Springfield Elementary doesn't have the resources or the will to maintain it. Homer doesn't have the capacity to sustain it. The system that Bart inhabits is not designed to cultivate the kind of intelligence he has. It's designed to measure a different kind, and to sort people according to that measurement. And so, Bart is sorted wrong. He is categorized as an underachiever, a troublemaker, a disciplinary problem, and these categories, once applied, shape how others interact with him in ways that produce more of the behaviors the categories describe. He becomes the underachiever partly because the system tells him that's what he is and provides him no alternative story to live into. This is the tragedy of Bart. Not that he failed, but that the system failed to recognize what he was offering. Not that he lacked potential, but that the potential was never given adequate conditions to develop. And Bart, being Bart, has adapted to this failure by becoming excellent at what the system says he is. He is the best underachiever Springfield has ever seen, the most creative troublemaker, the most socially intelligent failure. He has taken the category they assigned him and mastered it, because that's what he does. He masters things. It's just that the thing he's mastered isn't quite what he might have mastered if the circumstances had been different. The show mourns this, quietly, in the gaps between the comedy, In the specific look Bart sometimes gets when he's done something extraordinary and realizes that no one around him knows that's what just happened. In the rare moments of genuine connection between Bart and an adult who sees him clearly, and the difficulty of sustaining those moments against the weight of everything else, Bart will be 10 years old forever. He will never grow into what he might have been. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the floating timeline, the frozen age, is most heartbreaking for Bart because he is the one with the most to become, and he is the one who has been most completely denied the becoming. Final section. What Springfield teaches us about home. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. Hours, now. We've walked every street, visited every major mystery, sat with each character in their difficulty and their complexity and their specific form of yearning. And I want to end not with another mystery, but with a feeling. The feeling that all these mysteries ultimately serve. Springfield, for all its strangeness and all its darkness and all its carefully preserved contradictions, is fundamentally a show about home, about what it means to have a place that knows you, about what it costs to maintain that place and that knowledge over time, about what we gain and lose in the decision to stay. The characters in Springfield stay. This is the defining fact about all of them, more defining than their individual quirks or their specific storylines or their relationships to the show's larger mysteries. They stay. Homer stays at the plant. Marge stays in the marriage. Bart stays in the 5th grade. Lisa stays in the 2nd grade. Ned stays next door. Krusty stays behind the camera. Even Burns stays in Springfield, when a man of his resources could go literally anywhere. They stay because Springfield is home. Not because it's good, not because it's fair, not because it gives them what they deserve. It doesn't, mostly. Not any of them, but because it's theirs. Because it contains the specific people and places and relationships that have, over time, become constitutive of who they are. Because leaving would mean becoming someone new, and becoming someone new always requires leaving behind something of who you are now. And the cost of that departure, for most of them, is too high. This is not wisdom the show states directly. It accumulates it across episodes, across seasons, across the long arc of a show that has outlasted virtually everything else on American television. It accumulates it in the specific way that lived experience accumulates. Slowly, unevenly, through moments of clarity separated by long stretches of ordinary blur. But here you are, at the end of a long night in Springfield, and maybe you feel it, the pull of it, the recognition of something true about the specific gravity of home, of the places and people that hold us, that we hold, that we can't quite leave, because to leave them would be to leave a version of ourselves behind. Springfield is home. For the characters who live there and for the audience that keeps returning, we can't leave it because it's ours now too, in the way that stories you've lived with long enough become yours. The specific yellow of it, the specific warmth, the couch and the family, and the joke you've heard 1,000 times that still, somehow, lands. The mysteries are real. The strangeness is real. The darkness is real. But so is the warmth. So is the love. So is the specific quality of Tuesday evenings in a house on Evergreen Terrace, where the television is on, and the family is together, and the story is happening again. The same story, the endless story, the story that doesn't end because we won't let it. Good night. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. End of script. Approximate total. 42,000 plus words. Final deep dives. The last mysteries. The mystery of Lisa's saxophone art in a town that doesn't listen. Lisa Simpson plays the saxophone. She has played it since the very beginning of the show, and across 35 years of episodes, her relationship with her instrument has become one of the show's most sustained and quietly moving narrative threads. She plays it not because Springfield asks her to. Springfield has never asked Lisa to do anything she actually wants to do. She plays it because she needs to, because the saxophone is the place where the distance between who she is and what Springfield allows her to be collapses, briefly, into pure expression. Music does this for people. It's one of the things music is for, giving you a place where the compromises of ordinary social life don't apply, where you can be completely what you are without negotiation or translation or the exhausting work of explaining yourself to people who don't quite understand. In music, you don't have to explain. You just play. Lisa plays in the gaps, in the spaces between the family's chaos, In the moments when Springfield's collective indifference to her inner life becomes too much to absorb with the patience she usually manages. She goes to her room, or she goes outside, or she simply brings the saxophone up to her lips wherever she happens to be and she plays. And something happens when she plays. The show marks it. The animation changes quality slightly, not always, but in the moments that matter, the visual grammar of the saxophone scenes has a different weight than the comedic sequences surrounding them. The music itself, composed specifically for these moments, has a quality of genuine emotional investment that the background score doesn't always have. The show is taking Lisa's music seriously. In a show built substantially on a reverence on the comedy of taking nothing seriously, Lisa's saxophone is one of the things the show treats with consistent reverence. Why? Because Lisa's saxophone is the show's conscience. Not her political activism, not her academic brilliance, not her moral arguments, the saxophone. When Lisa plays, something true is happening in Springfield, and the show knows it. The mystery of Lisa's saxophone is the mystery of art in hostile conditions. How does it persist? How does something beautiful and specific and deeply personal survive in an environment that doesn't particularly value beauty or specificity, or the particular kind of interior richness that produces genuine artistic expression? It persists because it has to, because the people who need to make it can't not make it, regardless of whether the environment rewards them for it. Lisa would play even if no one ever listened. She plays because not playing would mean surrendering something essential, the thing that makes her, specifically, herself. Springfield has never been a good audience for Lisa. The town is not built for what she offers. And yet she has played, and played, and played 35 years of a small yellow girl with a large saxophone, making something beautiful in a town that mostly doesn't hear it. This is, quietly, one of the most heroic things in The Simpsons. Not Homer saving the day, not Bart outwitting the antagonist. Lisa, alone with her saxophone, making art because stopping would be the real catastrophe. The mystery of the flashback episodes Springfield's alternate histories. Over the course of its run, The Simpsons has returned repeatedly to the past, to various versions of the Simpsons family's history, to earlier periods of Springfield's existence, to the events that form the characters into who they are. These flashback episodes are, collectively, one of the show's most interesting narrative experiments. They're also one of the most revealing because of what they tell us about Springfield's relationship with its own history. The problem, which we've noted in various forms throughout the night, is that the flashbacks are inconsistent. The same character's origin has been told and retold with different details, different timelines, different emotional registers. Homer and Marge's courtship has been depicted in at least 4 substantially different versions across the show's run. The specific year of Homer's birth, which should be determinable from the floating timeline, is different depending on which episode you're using as your reference. Springfield's past is unstable. This could be lazy writing. Or it could be intentional, a reflection, within the show's logic, of something true about how communities and families relate to their own histories. Memory is unreliable. This is one of the most thoroughly documented findings in cognitive psychology, and it's a finding that has enormous implications for how we think about personal and collective history. We don't remember the past accurately. We reconstruct it, repeatedly, using available information and the needs of the present moment. The version of the past we access is always inflected by who we are now, what we need the past to be, what the present context makes salient. If Springfield's collective memory of its own history is unreliable, if the flashbacks are not accurate representations of what happened, but reconstructed accounts shaped by the needs of the storytelling moment, this is not a failure of the show's consistency. It's an accurate depiction of how memory actually works. Homer remembers his childhood the way he needs to remember it in the context of the story currently being told. Marge remembers their courtship in the way most useful for the emotional work of the current episode. The past is always being rewritten by the present, not because anyone is lying, but because the act of remembering is always an act of construction. Springfield's unstable past is, in this reading, Springfield's honest past. It is the past as it actually exists in memory multiple, contradictory, serving the needs of the people doing the remembering. And the question this raises is, what happened? What is the actual history of Springfield? The objective record of events that the various contradictory memories are all imperfectly attempting to access? The show will never tell us. Because the show doesn't know. Because no one knows. Not the characters, not the writers, not the show itself. The actual past of Springfield is the one thing that is genuinely inaccessible. Not because it was hidden or suppressed, but because memory doesn't work that way. The past doesn't persist intact. It transforms into stories, and the stories transform into other stories, and what remains is not the event but the meaning assigned to it. Springfield's history is the meaning Springfield has assigned to its history. And that meaning shifts, as all meaning shifts, with time and context and the needs of the people carrying it. This is, once you accept it, rather freeing. The inconsistencies in Springfield's past are not continuity errors. They are the truthful record of a community's relationship with its own story. The mystery of the guest stars. What celebrity means in Springfield. The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other television show in history. Over the course of 35 years, an essentially uncountable number of famous people have appeared as fictionalized versions of themselves or as characters in Springfield's stories. Musicians, actors, politicians, athletes, scientists, literary figures, cultural icons. The guest list reads like an index of late 20th and early 21st century celebrity culture. What is the significance of this? At one level, it's simply a creative strategy that worked. Celebrities brought their audiences to the show elevated the celebrity appearances through clever writing, and the combination produced some of the most memorable moments in the show's history. But at another level, the celebrity parade is itself a mystery worth examining. Because something happens to celebrity when it enters Springfield. Something changes. In the real world, fame operates as a kind of power. It grants access, creates asymmetries, produces deference. Famous people occupy a different social position than ordinary people, and they know it, and the people around them know it. In Springfield, fame doesn't work this way. The celebrities who visit Springfield are quickly, consistently, and thoroughly integrated into the show's existing social dynamics. They are treated by the main characters not with deference or awe, but with the particular combination of warmth and indifference that Springfieldians extend to most people. Homer doesn't particularly care that someone is famous. He cares whether they have donuts, whether they're blocking his view of the television, whether they're going to interfere with whatever he's currently trying to do. This levels something. The celebrities in Springfield are brought down from whatever pedestal they occupy in the real world and placed on the same floor as Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa. Their fame doesn't protect them from Springfield's specific quality of attention, which is the attention of people who have other things going on and find the famous person mildly interesting but not transformative. What does it mean to be famous in a town that doesn't quite recognize fame as a meaningful category? It means perhaps that you're just a person, which is both deflating and oddly relieving. No one in Springfield is going to mob you or make you perform your celebrity for them. They're going to treat you roughly the way they treat everyone else, which is with a friendly, distracted, occasionally baffling form of normalcy. The celebrities who work best in Springfield episodes are the ones who can relax into this normalcy, who find in Springfield's indifference not an insult but a kind of rest. The opportunity to be, for the duration of the episode, a person rather than a persona. And maybe this is the deepest thing Springfield offers the famous people who visit, a place where fame doesn't quite reach, where the ordinary human texture of existence, the donuts, the couch, the family, the specific small difficulties of daily life is more real than any amount of celebrity. Springfield is not impressed by fame. It is impressed by almost nothing, in fact, which is one of its most reliable qualities. It will not be awed. It will not be swept away. It will look at whatever you bring to it and respond in the specific terms of Springfield cheerfully, absurdly, with a warmth that doesn't distinguish between the famous and the unknown. This is, strangely, one of the most democratic things about the show. The guest stars come in, Springfield doesn't change for them. And when they leave, Springfield is exactly what it was, before, unchanged, unimpressed, ongoing. The guests pass through. Springfield remains. The mystery of Springfield's relationship with America, 35 years of reflection. We've touched on this throughout the night, but let's spend some sustained time with the relationship between Springfield and America, because it's more complex and more interesting than the usual. Springfield is a satire of America, framing suggests. Springfield is not just a satire of America. It is a love letter to America written in the language of satire, a thing that can only be understood if you hold both halves of that description simultaneously. The love is real. The Simpsons love Springfield, and Springfield is America, or a version of America, a compression of America, America's essential qualities extracted and intensified and given a specific yellow tint. The show loves the ordinary people of Springfield. It loves their specific human difficulties, their irrational attachments, their moments of grace, and their moments of failure. It loves Moe's Bar, and the Quickie Mart, and the nuclear plant, and the school, and the church, and the houses on Evergreen Terrace. It loves the small-town rhythms and the family dynamics, and the specific texture of middle American daily life. This love is the substrate. Everything else, the satire, the darkness, the exposure of corruption and incompetence and structural harm, operates on top of it. The critique is real, but the critique comes from love. You can only be this honest about a place if you care about it deeply enough to refuse to look away from what's wrong with it. This is the position of the best American social commentary across its history. Engaged, caring, angry in the specific way of someone who believes things could be better and watches them not be. Not alienated, not contemptuous, not standing outside and throwing stones. Inside, loving it, unable to leave, and therefore unable to stop seeing it clearly. The Simpsons is, in this lineage, one of the most American shows ever made. Not because it praises America, it doesn't, not uncritically, not systematically, but because it can't stop engaging with America. Can't stop trying to understand it, depict it, argue with it, make jokes about it, be horrified by it, be delighted by it. It's the relationship of a person with a complicated family. You don't get to choose it. You love it because it's yours. You see it clearly because you've been close enough for long enough. You'd be lost without it even when it drives you absolutely crazy. 35 years. Nearly 800 episodes. And what has the show said about America in all that time? That it's funnier than it knows, sadder than it admits, more capable than it performs, more corrupted at the top and more resilient at the base than the official story acknowledges. That ordinary people, given impossible circumstances, improvise with remarkable ingenuity. That institutions, given unchecked power, disappoint with remarkable consistency. That families, given every reason to fall apart, find ways to stay together that defy easy explanation. That the distance between who we are and who we want to be is the funniest and most heartbreaking gap in human experience. And that the effort to close it imperfect, ongoing, frequently comic, is what a life actually looks like. This is what the show says about America. This is what it has been saying, episode by episode, Sunday by Sunday, for 35 years. It says it through Homer's stupidity and Marge's patience, and Bart's defiance and Lisa's hope and Maggie's silence. It says it through Burns and Flanders and Wiggum and Apu and Krusty and Sideshow Bob. It says it through every background character who has ever appeared in the corner of a frame, living their small, vivid life. America is all of them. And all of them are America. The mystery of why we keep watching the final question. We've reached the end of our journey through Springfield, and I want to ask, one more time, the question I raised earlier. Why do we keep coming back? Not the analytical answer, not the cultural explanation, the personal one. The one that you might feel quietly, as you've been listening tonight, something about why this particular show, this particular family, this particular town, has a claim on you that other things don't. I think it's because Springfield is the place where everything is always all right in the end. Not good, the show is too honest for that. Not fair, not just, not safe or secure or well administered by competent authorities, but all right in the end. The family is together, the episode is over, the couch holds them. We live in a world where all right in the end is not guaranteed. Where families fall apart, where towns fail, where the systems that are supposed to protect people fail them instead. We know this. The show knows it too. It has been depicting these failures for 35 years. But the show also knows that in between the catastrophes, in between the failures and the forgettings, and the institutional disappointments, and the environmental contamination, and the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns and the impossibility of why no one ages, there are still the evenings, the specific warmth of being with people you know, the low-stakes hours, the couch, and the television, and the family, and the ordinary comedy of an ordinary life. Springfield holds that. It holds the warmth inside the strangeness. It keeps saying, yes, things are complicated. Yes, the world is difficult. Yes, Burns is still running things, and the fish have three eyes, and Homer is never going to fully understand what's happening to him. And also, there's still tonight. There's still the family. There's still the specific pleasure of a story that begins in chaos and ends, as always, in something like peace. This is what we keep coming back for. Not the mysteries, though the mysteries are interesting. Not the satire, though the satire is sharp. The warmth, the persistence of ordinary love in extraordinary circumstances. The family on the couch? Springfield endures because we need it to. Because the idea of a place that holds your people, that keeps them safe in the amber of a story, unchanging, always together, is something we reach for when the world outside is too much. Homer is in his chair. Marge is beside him. The children are arrayed around them. Somewhere in the background, the nuclear plant is glowing. Somewhere outside, Burns is alive and the fish have three eyes and no one has aged in 35 years. And none of that matters exactly in this moment. In this specific moment, the family is together. That's Springfield. That's why we stay. That's why, even at the end of 4 hours of mysteries and theories and careful attention to everything strange about this impossible town, the thing that remains is not a question but a feeling. Something like home. Good night, Springfield. Good night to whoever is still listening out there, in whatever corner of the actual world you're in, whatever time it is where you are, whatever it took to get to this quiet moment. You made it here, and Springfield was here when you arrived. It always will be. Sleep well. Script complete. Supplemental section. The smaller mysteries. The mystery of Ralph Wiggum. What is happening in there? There is a child in Springfield whose inner life the show has made completely inaccessible, and the inaccessibility is handled so consistently and so carefully that it stops feeling like a gap and starts feeling like a choice. Ralph Wiggum says things. He says them with complete sincerity. He says them in a way that suggests an interior life connected to external reality only intermittently, by threads that are never explained and never traced. I eated a sandwich, he says. My cat's breath smells like cat food, he says. I'm a unitard, he says. My daddy said to put me in the corner, he says. These statements are funny because they're unexpected. Because the connection between what's happening in a scene and what Ralph says about it is always sideways, not entirely wrong, not random, but at an angle to ordinary sense-making that the other characters share and Ralph doesn't. The fan theory about Ralph that circulates most persistently is also the simplest. Ralph is not unintelligent. Ralph is experiencing something. The statements he makes, the observations he offers, the specific quality of his disconnection from the conversational frame everyone else is operating in, these are not the outputs of a blank mind. They're the outputs of a mind processing things differently. In this reading, Ralph's utterances are meaningful. They are the product of a genuinely different relationship to experience, one that doesn't share the assumptions of neurotypical communication and therefore sounds to others like nonsense, but is internally coherent in ways we don't have the frame to access. Ralph sees things. He just sees them from an angle that other people can't occupy. And what he reports from that angle doesn't translate into the language everyone else uses, because the language was built for a perspective he doesn't have. This makes him, in some sense, the most genuinely mysterious person in Springfield. Everyone else's interiority is at least partially accessible. We know what Homer is thinking because Homer narrates his thoughts constantly, in words, in faces, in actions that express what he can't articulate. We know what Marge is thinking because her repression has a grammar we can learn to read. Even Maggie, whose silence is strategic, gives us enough behavioral data to construct hypotheses about her interior. Ralph gives us none of this. He gives us utterances that don't connect, that we can't use to triangulate. He remains, across 35 years of appearances, genuinely opaque. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Ralph is the show's reminder that not everyone is legible, that not every interior is accessible, that some people carry something we can't quite understand, and the correct response is not to explain it away or laugh at it, but to sit with the fact that it's there, alive, its own thing, as real and as complex as anything we do understand. Ralph is okay. This is something the show communicates consistently, underneath the comedy of his disconnection. He is content, in his way. He is loved, imperfectly but genuinely, by his father. He has a life that accommodates him. He persists, episode after episode, saying his sideways true things to a world that doesn't quite know what to do with them. He is, in this light, not a joke. He is a presence. Strange, particular, unexplained. Springfield has room for him. This is one of the better things about Springfield. The mystery of the Simpsons house architecture. As characterization. 742. Evergreen Terrace is, as we noted in our opening section, one of the most recognizable buildings in American popular culture. Its exterior is fixed the yellow walls, the front yard. The particular shape of it, while its interior is a maze of inconsistency. But let's spend some real time with that interior, because the interior of the Simpsons house is, in its own way, a sustained artistic achievement. The house has rooms that appear and disappear. It has a basement that sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't. It has a garage that has contained, at various points, enough objects and installations to fill a warehouse. The second floor has rooms that multiply and shrink depending on the needs of the episode. The kitchen is consistent. The specific arrangement of counter and table and window is almost always the same, but the space it occupies within the house's overall geometry shifts. What is the interior of the Simpsons house? One reading. It is a house that has been lived in by a family for decades, and that has been adapted and changed and expanded and contracted to meet the evolving needs of that family. Houses that are actually lived in do this. They accumulate additions and modifications in repurposed spaces. The basement that appeared in Season 12 is not a continuity error. It's a basement that Homer finally got around to digging or was always there but never shown because the story hadn't required it yet. In this reading, the house's inconsistency is its realism. Real houses don't have perfectly consistent interiors across decades of habitation. Real houses change. Another reading. The house is the dream's architecture. If Homer is in a coma, the house is what his unconscious mind constructs as home. And dream homes are famous for their instability, for rooms that are in the wrong place, staircases that lead nowhere, layouts that don't match any real-world geometry. Dream homes are emotionally organized rather than spatially organized. The rooms are where you need them to be, not where they should be. Homer's dream house has the rooms he needs. The kitchen where the family gathers, the living room with the couch, the bedroom where Marge sleeps. Everything else is approximate there when needed, absent when not. A third reading. The house is big enough to contain everything the family needs because the family generates the space it needs. This is a slightly magical realist reading, but it fits Springfield's overall atmosphere. The house expands to hold whatever the episode requires it to hold because it is a fictional house and fictional houses have that option. All three readings coexist in the show's actual treatment of the space. The house is real and approximate and magical simultaneously. Like Springfield itself, like the floating timeline, like the mysteries that are never resolved, the house holds contradictions without choosing between them. And somehow, despite all the contradictions, it feels like home. Every time we see the exterior, the yellow walls, the tree in the front yard, the specific shape of the driveway, something in us recognizes it, not as a real place we've been to, but as the idea of a place, the idea of home. That's what 742 Evergreen Terrace is, in the end. Not a real house with real architecture. The idea of home, made visible. And we recognize it the way we recognize ideas that are true, not because we've seen them before, but because they resemble something we've always known. The mystery of Springfield's memory. Why the town forgets. We've touched on this in several places, but it deserves its own direct treatment. Why does Springfield forget? The town has been through extraordinary events. The dome, the environmental catastrophes, the shooting of Burns, the revelation that their principal was an imposter, multiple appearances by supernatural entities, alien visits, the literal blocking of the sun. Each of these events should, by any reasonable measure, be permanently part of Springfield's collective memory and ongoing civic conversation. They're not. By the next episode, they're gone. The slate is clean. The catastrophe is forgotten, and Springfield is exactly what it was before the catastrophe occurred. We've offered several frameworks for this. The coma theory's dreaming brain resetting between cycles, the radiation theory's cognitive damage preventing retention, the principal and the pauper's collective social choice to forget. Each of these explains the mechanism differently while agreeing on the fact Springfield forgets. But here's a dimension of the forgetting we haven't fully addressed. It's not just that Springfield forgets the bad things. It forgets the good things too. The moments of genuine community, of people rising to each other's need, of Springfield being better than its baseline, these also don't persist. Every episode is also a reset of the good things Springfield has managed. This is perhaps the truest thing about the show's relationship with memory. It's not selectively amnesiac about catastrophes specifically. It's amnesiac about everything. The town resets to baseline after every episode, positive or negative. The slate is clean of grief and of growth equally. Why? Maybe because the show understands something about how communities actually work. Real communities don't accumulate their history in neat narratives that lead somewhere. They cycle. The same arguments recur. The same mistakes are made. The same moments of grace appear and disappear. There is progress over long enough timescales. Communities do change, but the change is slow and nonlinear and frequently indistinguishable from inside the community, from simple cycling. Springfield's forgetting is the exaggerated version of this. The reset that happens between episodes is a compression of the reset that happens more slowly in real communities. In real life, it takes years or decades for a significant community event to fade enough that people stop referencing it. In Springfield, it takes a week. But the pattern is the same. The town continues. The events accumulate without quite becoming history. The people go on living, not quite building on what came before, not quite starting fresh, but somewhere in between carrying forward the emotional residue of what happened without the explicit memory of it. Maybe that's what Springfield's collective amnesia is. Not forgetting, but processing. The events happen. They matter. They shape the community in ways that aren't visible as conscious memory but are present as emotional texture, as habit, as the specific quality of how Springfieldians relate to each other after what they've been through. The town doesn't remember what happened, but it carries what happened in ways it can't quite articulate. This too is very human. This too is how trauma and joy and community experience actually live in people and in places. Not as discrete memories that can be retrieved and discussed, but as the atmosphere, the feeling of a place, the specific quality of its air. Springfield's air is the air of a place that has been through things, that carries things it can't quite name. That is shaped by a history it can't quite remember. When you walk into a room that has history that has absorbed the events that happened in it, you feel it, even if no one tells you what the history is. There's a weight, a texture, something in the air that the air can't explain. Springfield has that. 35 years of accumulated unremembered events, living in the atmosphere of the town, shaping its residents in ways they don't have language for. This is the deepest mystery of Springfield's forgetting. It's not absence. It's presence of a kind we don't have the tools to measure. The mystery of what comes after Springfield's future. Every long-running story eventually faces the question of what comes after. What happens when the story ends? What is the world of this story like in the future beyond the final episode? The Simpsons has imagined several futures flash-forward episodes, hypothetical scenarios, alternate timelines. But the show's actual future, the one that will eventually exist when the show finally ends, remains appropriately unknown. What would it look like? If time were allowed to move normally, if the floating timeline were dropped, if Springfield were allowed to age at the rate the real world ages, what would we find? Bart, now in his mid-40s, probably still in Springfield, probably still carrying the specific combination of gifts and damage potential that the show has given him. Maybe he found something he was good at that the show never quite explored. Maybe he became, in the way that people sometimes do, more than the system that processed him expected. Or maybe he became, as his flash-forward episodes suggest, someone who got stuck, who couldn't quite convert his intelligence into anything the world would pay for, who is still, at 45, doing some version of what he's been doing since he was 10. Lisa, wherever she ended up, probably not in Springfield, but probably not quite free of it either. The show has consistently depicted Lisa's future as one of achievement and isolation, of leaving and succeeding and carrying, always, the wound of coming from a place that didn't know what to do with her. She left, but you don't leave Springfield completely. You carry it. Homer and Marge, older. The dynamic between them shifting, as it does in all long marriages, in ways that are hard to predict from the outside. More ease in some ways, perhaps. More patience with each other's specific textures. Different challenges from the ones the show has given them, but still together, in all probability, because they are the kind of people who stay together. And Maggie, by the time the future arrives, by the time the show finally ends, and Springfield finally ages, Maggie will be whatever she's been waiting to be. The long silence will have resolved. The observation will have converted into action. What that action is, we don't know. The show has protected Maggie's future more carefully than any other characters. She is the one whose next move is completely hidden. Maybe that's right. Maybe the youngest child, the one with the most to become, should remain the mystery, should remain the open question that the story leaves behind when it ends. Springfield's future is Maggie's decision. She's been preparing for it since 1989. We'll find out when she's ready. The mystery of the show itself, why it keeps going. 35 years, nearly 800 episodes. The longest-running animated series in American history. The longest-running American primetime scripted television program. A show that has outlasted every cultural moment that seemed certain to eclipse it, that has survived the rise and fall of multiple entertainment paradigms, that has persisted through the era of appointment television and the streaming revolution, and the fragmentation of the media landscape into 1,000 competing platforms. Why is The Simpsons still running? The practical answers are real. The show is profitable. It has brand value. Fox has, over the decades, built enough of its identity around the show that the show's continuation is partially self-sustaining through institutional inertia. These are real factors, but they don't explain why the show continues to find audiences, why people who weren't born when it premiered are watching it niches, why it has managed to remain culturally present, not dominant, perhaps, not the phenomenon it was in 1993, but present across multiple generations of viewers. The answer, I think, is that the show found something early and has been faithful to it. Something that doesn't date. Something that will still be true in another 35 years if the show somehow makes it that far. It found the specific humor of ordinary life, of the gap between aspiration and reality, of the way the simplest plans go wrong and the most straightforward situations become complicated, and the people we love most are also the people who drive us most completely crazy. Of the fact that all of this is simultaneously the worst thing and the funniest thing and the most human thing about being alive. This doesn't go out of style. It can't. Because the conditions that produce it, being a person, in a family, in a community, trying to navigate a world that is always slightly more complicated than expected, don't change. The technology changes, the culture changes, the specific form of the complications changes. But the basic situation doesn't. Homer is always trying to get home and always getting distracted on the way. Marge is always trying to hold it together and finding it harder than it should be. Bart is always trying to get away with something and occasionally succeeding. Lisa is always trying to understand something and finding that understanding is more complicated than it seemed. These are not dated premises. They're eternal ones, dressed in different clothes every decade, but the same underneath. The Simpsons keeps running because it keeps being true about the things that are always true. And there is no expiration date on that. There is no end to Springfield. Not while people are still living the ordinary comedy of ordinary life. Not while Homer is still trying to get home. Script complete. Approximate total, 40,000 plus words. Afterward, a letter to Springfield. Dear Springfield, we've spent a long time with you tonight. Hours, really. We walked your streets and opened your doors and sat with your people in their difficulty and their joy and the particular quality of ordinary life that you've been depicting with remarkable consistency and remarkable care. For 35 years, you are a strange town. You are impossible in ways that compound over time. The more carefully you're examined, the stranger you become. The physics don't add up. The geography doesn't hold. The biology defies explanation. The timeline refuses to commit to a direction. Your residents age without aging, remember without remembering, forget without quite forgetting. And you are, despite all of this, one of the most recognizable places in the world. People who have never been to America know Springfield. People who watch the show dubbed in their language, who grew up with a translated version of Homer's voice and Bart's catchphrases and the specific yellow warmth of the animation, know Springfield. The town that doesn't exist on any map is more visited, in imagination, than most real cities. The house that has no consistent floor plan has been lived in, vicariously by more people than any real house ever will be. How did this happen? Because you got something right that real places sometimes get wrong. You made room for everyone. For Homer, who is ridiculous and lovable in equal measure. For Marge, who is patient past the point of any reasonable explanation. For Bart, who is exactly as complicated as a 10-year-old who will always be 10, has any right to be. For Lisa, who is too good for you and stays anyway. For Maggie, who is whatever she is, watching and waiting. And for all the people beyond the Simpson house, the ones who fill your streets and populate your bars and run your nuclear facility and stand in your background being themselves, fully, in the seconds they're given. You made room for all of them. You gave them enough space to be real. Even the ones who appear for 30 seconds and are never seen again. This is the deepest thing about you, Springfield. You are capacious. You can hold more than seems possible. You contain multitudes, not just characters but possibilities. Not just people, but the idea of people. All the variations on humanness that 35 years of imagining and writing and drawing have been able to encompass. We leave you tonight the way we always leave you, knowing you'll be here when we come back. Knowing that whatever has changed in the real world, whatever new difficulties the actual present has accumulated, you will be there in your specific impossible warmth, with the family on the couch and the plant at the edge of town and the fish in the river with 3 eyes that nobody quite manages to fully explain. The mysteries remain. They always will. That's what makes you worth returning to. Thank you for the company. Until next time, a note on the theories. Everything explored in this script is offered in the spirit of imaginative engagement rather than definitive interpretation. The Simpsons is a rich enough text to support many readings simultaneously, and the fan theories and speculative frameworks discussed here are valuable not because they're correct, most of them can't be proven or disproven from the text, but because they demonstrate how deeply, seriously, the show has been engaged with by its audience across 3.5 decades. The writers of The Simpsons have, over the years, occasionally engaged with fan theories directly, sometimes endorsing them implicitly, sometimes explicitly denying them, most often simply continuing to produce work that supports multiple interpretive frameworks simultaneously. This ambiguity is not a failure of the show's coherence. It is, arguably, one of the show's greatest achievements. A fictional world rich enough to sustain serious engagement, to reward careful attention, to mean different things to different people at different moments in their lives. The Homer coma theory will not be confirmed. The Burns immortality theory will not be resolved. The Who Shot Burns mystery will remain, in some important sense, open regardless of the episode that nominally closed it. Springfield's location will never be definitively established. These are not loose ends. They are the threads that keep people coming back. The questions that make the text live beyond any single viewing, any single reading, any single encounter with the show. Springfield is a mystery. Springfield is always a mystery. And some mysteries are more valuable for not being solved.